What if I told you that buried beneath the frozen wastelands of Alaska lies something that could change everything we know about human history? Something that's not ancient at all, but very much alive. Tonight's story comes from a request by Matul Patel 9283. Thank you for this incredible suggestion. If you have ideas for future stories, please leave them in the comments below. And if you enjoy these tales that blur the line between fact and fiction, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more mysterious stories that will keep you wondering. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what I found beneath 200 feet of Alaskan permafrost, and why the government wants me to forget it ever existed. I'm a civil engineer, nothing glamorous about it. I measure soil density, calculate load-bearing capacities, and make sure buildings don't sink into the ground. For 15 years, I've worked contracts across the country, from Florida swamplands to Nevada deserts. Alaska was supposed to be just another job. The US Army Corps of Engineers hired me in March 2023 to survey land stability for a proposed pipeline route. Nothing unusual there. Energy companies are always looking to move oil from point A to point B, and they need someone to tell them their pipes won't crack when the ground shifts. The pay was good, the timeline was reasonable, and I needed the work. The assignment took me to a stretch of wilderness about 60 miles northwest of Fairbanks. On paper, it looked simple, a 3-month survey of geological stability across a 40-mile corridor. I'd use ground-penetrating radar, seismographs and core samples to map what lay beneath the surface. Standard procedure. I should have known something was off when they gave me a satellite phone with specific instructions to check in every 12 hours. Weather can change fast up there, the project coordinator explained. We need to know you're alive. But Alaska's a dangerous place. People disappear into the wilderness all the time. It seemed reasonable. I flew into Fairbanks on a Tuesday in April, rented a heavy-duty pickup truck and loaded it with equipment. The drive to my assigned sector took 3 hours on increasingly rough roads. The last 20 miles were barely more than frozen tyre tracks cutting through endless stands of black spruce and birch. When I finally reached my starting coordinates, the silence was absolute. No wind, no animals, no aircraft overhead. Just me, my equipment, and thousands of square miles of nothing. That's when the work began, and that's when everything I thought I knew about the world started to unravel. The first week went exactly as planned. I established a base camp with a generator-powered trailer and methodically began surveying the proposed pipeline route. The ground-penetrating radar showed typical permafrost patterns, layers of ice and soil that had been frozen for millennia. My seismograph readings were clean, showing the kind of stable bedrock that pipeline engineers love to see. Core samples revealed nothing unusual, standard Arctic soil composition with good load-bearing characteristics. I was making excellent progress. Then, on day 8, something changed. I was setting up the radar array for the morning survey when I noticed interference patterns on my display. Instead of the usual chaotic scattering that indicates rock and soil, I was seeing geometric shapes. At first I assumed it was equipment malfunction. Electronic devices can act strangely in extreme cold, and I'd been pushing my gear hard. I recalibrated the radar, replaced cables, and ran diagnostic tests. Everything checked out perfectly, but the shapes remained straight lines, perfect 90-degree angles, and beneath everything a massive triangular form with sides that extended beyond my radar's maximum penetration depth of 200 feet. I switched to the seismograph, thinking maybe sound waves would give me different data. I set off small explosive charges and measured how the shock waves travelled through the ground. Standard geological surveying technique. The results made no sense. Sound waves were reflecting off something solid and geometrically perfect about 150 feet down. The reflection pattern showed clean edges, flat surfaces, and precise angles. In nature, you don't find precise angles. Rivers meander, mountains erode into curves, and rock formations crack in random patterns. This was something else entirely. I spent the rest of that day running every test I could think of. Different frequencies, multiple angles, overlapping surveys. every single measurement confirmed the same impossible truth. There was a massive pyramid buried beneath the permafrost, and it was huge. My calculations suggested sides at least 800 feet long, significantly larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The depth readings indicated it was sitting on bedrock, which meant it had been built on the surface and then buried by millions of years of geological processes. Except that made no sense either. Alaska's geological history doesn't include ancient civilizations capable of megalithic construction. The entire region was under glacial ice until relatively recently in geological terms. I sat in my trailer that night staring at the printouts and digital displays, trying to find any explanation that didn't challenge everything I understood about engineering and archaeology. Maybe it was a natural formation that just happened to look geometric. Maybe my instruments were picking up interference from buried metal or deposits. Maybe the extreme cold was affecting my equipment in ways I didn't understand. But deep down I knew I was looking at something artificial, something that had been deliberately constructed and then hidden beneath the ice. The question was, who built it, and why? I needed supplies, and more importantly, I needed to talk to someone who knew the area's history. The nearest settlement was a village called Yukon Crossing. Population 127 according to the road sign. It was a 40-minute drive south on a road that tested every shock absorber in my truck. Yukon Crossing looked like a lot of rural Alaskan towns. A handful of weathered buildings clustered around a general store and a combination post office-gas station. Most of the residents lived in trailer homes or log cabins scattered among the trees. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin grey columns against the bright spring sky. The general store served as the unofficial community centre. Inside, I found an elderly native Alaskan man named Joseph Kaltag behind the counter, selling everything from canned goods to ammunition to fishing gear. He looked like he'd been running the place for decades. "You're the pipeline engineer," he said before I could introduce myself. It wasn't a question. "Word travels fast," I replied. "Not much happens around here." He rang up my purchases: batteries, fuel canisters, and enough food to last another week. "You working up in the Forbidden Valley?" I looked up from counting cash. Forbidden Valley? Joseph's weathered face remained expressionless, but I caught something in his eyes. Concern, maybe, or warning. That's what my grandfather called it. Said the spirits there were angry, animals won't go near it, and hunters who get too close. He shrugged. "Their compasses don't work right." "Magnetic interference," I said automatically. "Probably iron ore deposits in the bedrock. Maybe," he handed me my change, "or maybe some things are better left buried." I was loading supplies into my truck when a younger native woman approached. She introduced herself as Marie Kaltag, Joseph's granddaughter, and a pilot who flew supply runs to remote camps throughout the region. "I heard you talking to Grandpa," she said, "about the valley where you're working." He mentioned compass problems. Marie glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "It's more than that. I've flown over that area maybe 50 times in the last 10 years. My instruments go crazy. GPS cuts out, radio gets static, engine RPMs fluctuate." "Electromagnetic interference," I suggested. That's what I thought too. But 3 years ago I was flying a supply run to a hunting camp about 20 miles north of your work site. Clear day, perfect visibility. I was following the river when my GPS started spinning. Compass needle was rotating like a clock hand. She paused, clearly uncomfortable with the memory. I looked down to try to navigate by landmarks, and I saw something that shouldn't have been there. Lines in the snow, geometric patterns like someone had carved designs into the landscape. They were huge, maybe a mile across and perfectly symmetrical. Could have been natural formations, wind patterns, erosion channels. Marie shook her head. "I've been flying over Alaska my whole life. I know what natural looks like. This was artificial. And when I flew back over the same area a week later, the lines were gone, covered by fresh snow." I thanked her for the information and headed back to camp, but I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Geometric patterns in the snow, electromagnetic interference, compasses spinning wildly. It all pointed to the same conclusion I was trying to avoid. Something beneath the permafrost was actively affecting the environment around it. That night, I reviewed my survey data again. looking for any detail I might have missed. The pyramid structure was consistent across all my measurements, but there was something else. Subtle variations in the electromagnetic readings that suggested complex internal architecture. Whatever was down there, it wasn't just a solid mass of stone. It had chambers, passages, and what looked like intricate internal mechanisms. And according to my instruments, some of those mechanisms were drawing electrical current. I woke up on day 12 to the sound of helicopter rotors. From my trailer window I could see a Black Hawk settling onto a flat area about 200 yards from my camp. No military markings, but the aircraft had the unmistakable look of government hardware. 3 men in winter camouflage climbed out as the rotors spun down. They walked directly to my trailer with the confident stride of people who expected cooperation. The leader was a tall man with close-cropped hair and reflective sunglasses. His companions looked like soldiers trying to dress like civilians, too alert, too fit, and carrying themselves like they had weapons hidden under their jackets. "Mr. Harrison," the leader said, reading my name from a tablet. "I'm Agent Collins, Department of Homeland Security. We need to discuss your recent survey findings." I stepped outside, keeping my expression neutral. I wasn't aware DHS had jurisdiction over pipeline surveys. "We have jurisdiction over potential national security threats." Collins gestured toward my equipment array. "Your seismic activity has been flagged by our monitoring systems. We need to examine your data and confiscate any materials related to subsurface anomalies." "What subsurface anomalies?" Collins removed his sunglasses, revealing pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Mr. Harrison, we know exactly what you found down there. The question is whether you're going to cooperate voluntarily or make this difficult. I had 2 choices: hand over my data willingly or watch them take it by force. Either way, they were getting what they wanted. "The hard drives are in the trailer," I said. One of Collins' men immediately headed inside while the other began disconnecting my external monitoring equipment. They worked with practiced efficiency, clearly familiar with this type of confiscation. "How long have you known it was there?" I asked. Collins was quiet for a long moment, apparently deciding how much to tell me. "The structure first appeared on our deep scanning systems in 1992. We've been monitoring it ever since." "Appeared? You mean you discovered it in 1992? "No, Mr. Harrison. I mean it appeared in 1992. Prior to that date, our scans showed normal bedrock composition. Then something changed." The man emerging from my trailer handed Collins a bag containing my hard drives and backup storage devices. They had also taken my printed survey maps and handwritten notes. 1992, I said, thinking out loud. That's when China conducted their largest underground nuclear test. Collins' expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of something. Surprise, maybe, that I'd made that connection. "The Lopner test was 3,800 miles away," he said. "There's no possible connection." But his tone suggested otherwise, and I remembered something from my geological studies. Seismic waves from large underground explosions can travel through the Earth's crust and trigger responses in sensitive areas thousands of miles away. What if the Chinese nuclear test had somehow activated whatever was buried beneath the Alaskan permafrost? "You're being reassigned," Collins continued, handing me an official-looking document. "Your contract has been terminated due to unforeseeable circumstances. A helicopter will arrive tomorrow morning to transport you back to Fairbanks." "What about my equipment?" "It's been contaminated by proximity to hazardous materials. Standard decontamination procedures require disposal." That was obviously a lie. There were no hazardous materials in the area. I'd have detected them during my survey. They were confiscating everything because they didn't want me to have any physical evidence of what I'd found. "One more thing," Collins said as his team prepared to leave. "You'll be required to sign a non-disclosure agreement before returning to civilian areas. The penalty for violating that agreement is 10 years in federal prison." They climbed back into their helicopter and lifted off, leaving me alone with my suddenly empty trailer and a growing certainty that I'd stumbled into something much bigger than a pipeline survey. But I still had one advantage. They thought they'd taken all my data. They were wrong. I've always been paranoid about data backup. Too many years of watching hard drives crash and taking blame for lost survey information. So I keep a small handheld GPS unit with built-in memory storage that automatically logs all my location coordinates and instrument readings. Collins and his team had missed it because it was clipped to my belt, looked like standard hiking gear and wasn't connected to my main computer systems. That night, I reviewed the stored data on the device's tiny screen. Everything was there. Coordinates, depth readings, electromagnetic measurements, and seismic mapping data. Enough information to prove that something massive and artificial was buried beneath the permafrost. But proof wasn't enough. I needed to understand what it was and why the government was so determined to keep it secret. I made a decision that probably should have gotten me killed. I was going back to the site for one final investigation. The helicopter pickup was scheduled for 8 a.m, which gave me about 6 hours of darkness to work with. I loaded basic equipment into my backpack: the handheld GPS, the digital camera, a small electromagnetic field detector, and a battery-powered radio, and hiked back to the survey area. The night was clear and bitterly cold. My breath formed ice crystals that seemed to hang in the air, and the snow crunched under my boots with sounds like breaking glass. Above me, the aurora borealis painted green curtains across the star-filled sky. I reached the coordinates where my instruments had detected the pyramid's apex. According to my calculations, I was standing directly above the structure's highest point, about 120 feet below my boots. The handheld detector immediately started showing readings. Electromagnetic activity was significantly higher than background levels, and it seemed to be increasing. The device's small screen showed wave patterns that looked almost like a heartbeat, regular pulses of energy rising and falling in consistent cycles. I took photos of the instrument readings and recorded GPS coordinates, building a digital record that I could hopefully smuggle out of Alaska. But as I worked, something strange began happening. The aurora overhead was changing. Instead of the usual flowing curtains of light, it was forming geometric patterns, straight lines and angular shapes that mirrored the underground structure. It was as if the buried pyramid was somehow influencing the electromagnetic phenomena in the upper atmosphere. That's when I felt the vibration. It started as a barely perceptible tremor in the ground, like the feeling of a distant freight train. But it quickly intensified until I could feel it in my bones. A deep, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to synchronize with the electromagnetic readings on my detector. The device's screen was flashing warnings. Energy levels were spiking far beyond anything I'd measured during my official survey. Whatever was buried down there was waking up. I started backing away from the site, but before I could get more than 50 yards, everything electronic I carried died simultaneously. The GPS unit, the detector, my digital camera, even my LED flashlight, all dead, as if something had delivered a massive electromagnetic pulse. Above me, the aurora was blazing brighter than I'd ever seen, forming complex geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The air itself seemed to be humming with energy, and I could feel static electricity building up on my clothing and exposed skin. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The aurora faded back to normal patterns. The ground vibration ceased. The electrical sensation disappeared. I was left standing in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness in complete darkness, holding a handful of dead electronics. I stumbled back toward camp using starlight for navigation, reaching my trailer just before dawn. When I tried to start my truck, the engine turned over immediately. Apparently whatever had killed my handheld electronics hadn't affected the vehicle's more robust electrical system. But I knew what I had experienced wasn't natural. The buried pyramid wasn't just an ancient artifact or geological formation. It was some kind of active installation that could influence electromagnetic fields across a wide area. The question was, what was its purpose? The helicopter arrived exactly at 8 a.m, piloted by a civilian contractor who seemed unaware that he was participating in a government cover-up. During the flight back to Fairbanks, I signed the non-disclosure agreement Collins had mentioned, legally binding myself to remain silent about my discoveries. But signing the paper didn't erase my memory, and it didn't eliminate the data I'd managed to keep hidden. I flew back to Seattle that afternoon and spent the next 2 weeks trying to return to normal life. I updated my resume, contacted potential clients, and attempted to focus on finding my next engineering contract. But I couldn't stop thinking about what lay buried beneath the Alaskan permafrost. Late one night, unable to sleep, I sat down with my laptop and started researching everything I could find about electromagnetic anomalies, underground structures, and the 1992 Chinese nuclear test that Agent Collins had mentioned. What I discovered changed everything. The Chinese test, conducted at the Lop Nür facility on May 21, 1992, was indeed one of the largest underground nuclear explosions ever detonated. The blast was so powerful that seismic monitoring stations around the world recorded the shockwaves as they travelled through the Earth's crust. But that wasn't the interesting part. I found archived scientific papers describing unusual electromagnetic phenomena that occurred globally in the days following the test. Radio disruptions, satellite communication failures, and compass anomalies were reported from locations thousands of miles away from the blast site. Most significantly, several research stations in Alaska reported sudden spikes in local electromagnetic activity, beginning approximately 6 hours after the Chinese detonation. Exactly the amount of time it would take seismic waves to travel through the Earth's crust from Lop Nür to Alaska. I cross-referenced these reports with geological surveys of the Alaskan region and found something that made my blood run cold. Every single electromagnetic anomaly had been reported from locations within a 50-mile radius of my survey site. Whatever was buried there had indeed been activated by the Chinese nuclear test, just as Collins had implied, but the implications went far beyond a simple cause and effect relationship. I started plotting the locations of other reported anomalies on a world map, looking for patterns. What I found was a global network of similar sites, places where electromagnetic activity had spiked following major seismic events, underground installations that seemed to respond to specific triggers. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that the Alaskan pyramid wasn't unique. It was part of a worldwide system of buried structures, all apparently designed to respond to geological disturbances, but designed by whom, and for what purpose? I thought back to the night I'd witnessed the energy pulse, remembering how the aurora borealis had formed geometric patterns directly above the burial site. Aurora phenomena are caused by charged particles from the sun interacting with Earth's magnetic field. If the underground structure could influence those interactions, it was essentially broadcasting energy into space. What if the buried pyramids weren't ancient monuments at all? What if they were communication devices, a global network designed to transmit signals to somewhere far beyond Earth? The possibility was terrifying and fascinating in equal measure. If I was right, then humanity shared the planet with technology that predated our entire civilization by potentially millions of years. Technology that was still active, still responding to triggers, still sending messages to unknown recipients. I spent weeks researching similar sites around the world, building a database of locations where unusual electromagnetic phenomena had been reported following major seismic events. The pattern that emerged was undeniable, a global network of transmission stations, all apparently activated by disturbances in the Earth's crust. But before I could take my research any further, I received a letter that ended my investigation permanently. The letter arrived exactly 1 month after my return from Alaska. It was delivered by certified mail to my apartment address, though I hadn't given that information to anyone connected with the pipeline project. The return address showed only Department of Interior Special Projects Division, with a Washington, D.C. postal box number. Inside was a single page of official letterhead containing a brief message. Mr. Harrison, this communication serves as final notice regarding your terminated contract with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, project classification, Black Ice. Subsequent to your departure from the survey area, additional geological analysis has determined that the subsurface structure you detected is not archaeological in nature. The structure is an active installation of unknown origin that poses potential risks to national security. Any attempt to publicise information related to this discovery will result in immediate prosecution under the Espionage Act of 1917. Your signed non-disclosure agreement remains in full effect indefinitely. The installation you discovered is not a relic. It is a machine. Do not pursue further inquiry. Sincerely, Director, Special Projects Division. I read the letter 3 times before the full implication sank in. They weren't denying what I'd found. They were confirming it. The underground structure was artificial. It was active, and the government had known about it for over 30 years without understanding what it was or who had built it. But the most chilling aspect was the letter's final warning. It is a machine, not a monument, not an archaeological site, not a natural formation, a machine. I thought about the energy pulse I'd witnessed, the geometric patterns in the aurora, the electromagnetic signals that seemed to respond to seismic events around the world. If the buried pyramid was indeed a machine, then its purpose was clear. It was designed to detect and respond to geological disturbances by transmitting signals into space. The question remained, signals to whom? I locked the letter in a safety deposit box along with copies of all my survey data and research findings. If something happened to me, at least there would be evidence that the discovery had been made. But I never published my findings. I never contacted journalists or researchers or anyone else who might be interested in the truth about what lay beneath the Alaskan permafrost, because I realised that some knowledge carries a price too high to pay. If there really was a global network of alien communication devices buried beneath our feet, broadcasting our planet's geological status to unknown recipients in space, then humanity was living on borrowed time. We were tenants on a world that belonged to someone else, someone who had installed monitoring equipment long before our species existed. The machines weren't dormant relics of an ancient civilization. They were active components of a surveillance system that was still operational after millions of years. And every earthquake, every volcanic eruption, every nuclear test was sending updates to whoever had built them. I returned to my normal life as a civil engineer, taking contracts that kept me far from Alaska and far from any situation that might uncover similar installations. I told myself that ignorance was safer than knowledge, that some secrets were better left buried. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that machine humming beneath the permafrost. I wonder if it's still transmitting. I wonder who's listening, and I wonder what they plan to do when they decide we've learned too much about the world we think we own. For 6 months, I managed to convince myself that forgetting was possible. I took contracts in familiar territories, building inspections in suburban developments, soil analysis for shopping mall construction, routine work that involved nothing more mysterious than concrete and rebar. Then the dream started. At first they were just fragments, flashes of geometric light, the sound of deep humming that seemed to vibrate through my bones, the sensation of standing on solid ground while everything around me pulsed with invisible energy. I'd wake up with my heart racing and a metallic taste in my mouth, as if I'd been breathing electrified air. But the dreams became more vivid as weeks passed. I began seeing the pyramid not from above, as I had during my survey, but from within. Vast chambers carved from black stone that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Corridors that stretched beyond the reach of any illumination, filled with the constant sound of machinery that had been running for millennia. In these dreams, I wasn't alone. Shadowy figures moved through the passages, tall, elongated forms that seemed more like geometric projections than living beings. They moved with purpose, tending to controls and displays that covered the walls in intricate patterns of light and symbol. The most disturbing part was that they seemed aware of me. In the dreams, they would pause their activities and turn toward me with attention that felt like cold judgment. Without faces I could recognize, without voices I could understand, they somehow communicated a single clear message. I had seen something I wasn't meant to see. I consulted a sleep specialist, thinking the dreams were delayed stress responses from my time in Alaska. She prescribed medication that helped me fall asleep but didn't stop the visions. If anything, the drugs made them more intense, more real, more impossible to dismiss as products of an overwrought imagination. It was during one of these medicated dreams that I saw something new, a global map covered in points of light, each one marking a location where similar pyramids lay buried. The network stretched across every continent, even beneath the ocean floors, hundreds of installation sites, all connected by lines of energy that pulsed in synchronized patterns. I woke from that dream with absolute certainty that I was seeing something real. The buried machines weren't isolated installations. They were nodes in a planetary communication grid that spanned the entire world. 3 days later, I made a decision that changed everything. I started investigating again. Using the global locations from my dreams as starting points, I began researching electromagnetic anomalies and unexplained phenomena at similar sites around the world. What I found was a pattern so consistent it couldn't be coincidental. Every location where I'd dreamed of seeing a pyramid corresponded to a place where unusual events had been reported. The Nazca lines in Peru, built over an area where aircraft instruments malfunctioned regularly. The underwater structures near Bimini in the Bahamas, where submarines had reported mechanical failures and compass deviations. The Giza Plateau in Egypt, where modern surveys had detected massive voids beneath the known pyramids. Each site shared common characteristics: electromagnetic interference, geometric precision in ancient or unexplained structures, and a history of covering up or dismissing scientific findings that couldn't be easily explained. But the most significant pattern was temporal. Every site had experienced increased activity following major seismic events, exactly like the Alaskan installation after the 1992 Chinese nuclear test. I compiled a database of seismic events and electromagnetic anomalies dating back 50 years. The correlation was undeniable. Large earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and underground nuclear tests consistently triggered responses from specific locations around the globe. The buried machines weren't just monitoring geological activity, they were responding to it, broadcasting information about Earth's internal dynamics to receivers beyond our planet. I was building a case for the existence of a global alien surveillance network when I made a discovery that terrified me more than anything I'd found so far. The activity was increasing. According to my research, electromagnetic anomalies at these sites had been relatively stable for decades, showing only minor fluctuations in response to major geological events. But starting in 2020, the baseline activity levels had begun rising at all locations simultaneously. Something was changing. The network was becoming more active, more responsive, more awake. I plotted the activity increases on a timeline and noticed they correlated with something unexpected. The global increase in seismic activity over the past few years. More earthquakes, more volcanic eruptions, more geological instability than had been recorded in previous decades. What if the relationship wasn't cause and effect? What if the buried machines weren't just monitoring geological activity? What if they were causing it? The possibility was so disturbing I initially dismissed it as paranoid speculation. But the more I studied the data, the more compelling the evidence became. The timing was too precise, the correlations too consistent. If I was right, then humanity was living on a planet where alien technology was actively destabilizing the geological systems that supported all life on Earth. But why? What possible purpose could be served by triggering earthquakes and volcanic eruptions? The answer came to me during another dream, but this time I was prepared. I had set up a digital recorder beside my bed, hoping to capture any words or sounds I might make while experiencing the visions. What I heard when I played back the recording the next morning was my own voice, but speaking words I didn't remember saying. Stress testing, planetary stability assessment, structural analysis phase approaching completion. I'd somehow been speaking in the technical language of engineering, describing the geological chaos as if it were a planned evaluation of the planet's physical integrity. The machines weren't trying to destroy Earth, they were testing it. Over the following weeks, I dove deeper into geological data, looking for patterns that might support my terrifying hypothesis. What I found convinced me that the buried network was conducting a systematic analysis of Earth's structural stability. Seismic events weren't random, they were following a pattern. Stress points in tectonic plates were being tested in sequence, as if something was methodically evaluating how much pressure the planet's crust could withstand before catastrophic failure. The 2011 Japanese earthquake and tsunami, the 2010 Haiti earthquake, the increasing volcanic activity in Indonesia, Italy and Iceland, the unprecedented earthquake swarms in places like Oklahoma and Arkansas. All of these events clustered around locations where I'd identified buried installations. I created detailed models showing how the network might be triggering these events through focused electromagnetic pulses directed at specific geological fault lines. The technology required would be far beyond human capabilities, but for a civilization that could build planet-spanning monitoring networks, it would be routine engineering. But the most chilling aspect of my research was the timeline. If the current rate of geological testing continued, the network would have evaluated every major tectonic system on Earth within the next 5 to 10 years. What would happen when the testing phase was complete? I spent sleepless nights imagining scenarios, planetary mining operations that required clearing the surface of inconvenient biological life, terraforming projects that would remake Earth's atmosphere and geology, or simple property reclamation by the network's builders returning to a world they had left unattended for millennia. None of the possibilities included a future for human civilization. It was during this period of growing despair that I received an unexpected contact that changed everything once again. The email appeared in my inbox on a Tuesday morning with a subject line that made my blood freeze. Alaskan survey data, classification black ice. The sender's address was scrambled text that looked like a random string of characters, clearly routed through multiple encryption services to hide its origin. But the message content was brief and specific. Mr. Harrison, we know what you've discovered about the global network. Your research parallels investigations conducted by others who have encountered similar installations. A meeting has been arranged. Be at the Starbucks on Pine Street in downtown Seattle tomorrow at 3 p.m. Come alone. Bring your data. You're not the only one who has seen the machines. The message included no signature, but attached to it was a single photograph that made my hands shake. An image of my own survey equipment at the Alaskan site, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer had been watching my investigation from a significant distance. Someone had been monitoring me during my time in Alaska, someone who wasn't part of Agent Collins' government team. I spent the entire night debating whether to attend the meeting. It could be a trap, government agents trying to identify how much I knew and what evidence I still possessed. Or it could be exactly what it claimed, contact with others who had discovered the truth about the buried network. In the end, curiosity won over caution. I needed to know if I was really alone in this knowledge, or if there were others working to understand the threat humanity was facing. The Starbucks was crowded with the usual mix of students, business people and remote workers when I arrived at exactly 3 p.m. I ordered coffee and found a table near the back, trying to identify anyone who might be waiting for me. At 3:15, a woman in her 50s approached my table. She had greying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wore field clothing that suggested outdoor work, and carried herself with the confident posture of someone accustomed to physical challenges. "Mr. Harrison," she extended her hand. "I'm Catherine Webb. I think we need to talk." She sat down across from me and immediately began speaking in low, urgent tones. "I'm a marine archaeologist. 3 years ago, I was leading a deep-sea survey off the coast of Bermuda, when my team discovered an underwater structure that shouldn't exist. Geometric, massive, and actively generating electromagnetic fields that interfered with our equipment." She opened a tablet and showed me sonar images that looked remarkably similar to my ground-penetrating radar data from Alaska. A pyramid-shaped structure, perfectly symmetrical, sitting on the ocean floor at a depth of nearly a mile. When we tried to publish our findings, the research was classified and our funding was terminated. "Sound familiar?" I nodded, unable to speak. Catherine continued, "But I kept investigating privately. I found evidence of at least 12 similar installations in deep ocean locations around the world. All of them show the same characteristics: geometric precision, electromagnetic activity, and apparent activation following seismic events." She showed me more images: underwater structures near Japan, the Mediterranean, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Each one was clearly artificial, clearly ancient, and clearly active. "There are others," she said. "A geologist in Australia who found similar structures in the outback. An archaeologist in Egypt who discovered chambers beneath the Sphinx that contained technology that shouldn't exist. A seismologist in Chile who documented electromagnetic pulses preceding earthquake activity. How many others? We've identified 17 researchers worldwide who have encountered installations or phenomena that appear to be part of the same network. Most have been silenced through official pressure, funding cuts or career destruction. A few have simply disappeared. Catherine leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But some of us have continued working in secret. We've been sharing data, building a comprehensive picture of what we're dealing with. And what are we dealing with? A global surveillance and control system that's been operating for thousands of years, possibly millions. The installations aren't just monitoring Earth, they're managing it, controlling geological processes, atmospheric composition, even biological evolution through environmental manipulation. The implications hit me like a physical blow. We're not alone on this planet. We never have been. The question is whether humanity developed naturally, or whether we're the result of controlled biological development guided by whoever built the network. Catherine showed me more data, archaeological evidence of genetic bottlenecks in human evolution that corresponded to periods of unusual geological activity, atmospheric changes that seemed to follow patterns rather than random climate variation, even extinction events that appeared to have been artificially triggered. The network has been shaping Earth's development for millions of years, she said. Every mass extinction, every ice age, every major evolutionary leap has been guided by the installations. But why? What's the purpose? Catherine's expression was grim. We think Earth is being prepared for something. The stress testing you've documented, the increasing seismic activity, the atmospheric changes, it all points to final preparations for some kind of major transition. Transition to what? We don't know, but based on the escalating activity levels, we estimate it will begin within the next few years. She handed me a secure phone with an encrypted communication app. If you want to help us understand what we're facing, this will put you in contact with the others. We're working to decode transmissions from the installations to map the complete network, and to find some way to predict what's coming. What if we can't stop it? Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Then at least humanity will know the truth before the end. Over the following months, I became part of an underground network of researchers from around the world. Using encrypted communications and careful operational security, we shared data, theories, and discoveries about the installations that had consumed our professional lives. What emerged from our collective research was a picture of Earth that challenged everything humanity believed about our planet and our place in the universe. The installation network was vast. Over 300 confirmed sites across all continents and ocean floors. Each site contained structures of identical design but varying scale, all built from materials that didn't match any known geological formations. The construction showed evidence of technology far beyond human capabilities, with precision that exceeded our best modern engineering. But the most significant discovery came from Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a linguist and cryptographer in Japan who'd been analysing electromagnetic transmissions intercepted from the installations. The transmissions weren't random energy pulses. They were coded communications in a mathematical language that described Earth's physical and biological status in incredible detail. Real-time reports on atmospheric composition, geological stability, ocean chemistry, magnetic field fluctuations and biological diversity levels. More disturbing were the projections embedded in the transmissions, mathematical models showing how Earth systems would respond to various environmental stresses, including massive geological disruptions, atmospheric changes and population adjustments. The network was continuously updating these models based on data from the stress testing we documented. Each earthquake, each volcanic eruption, each environmental change provided new information that refined the projections, and all of the models pointed to the same conclusion: a massive intervention scheduled to begin when current biological systems reached predetermined stress thresholds. We were approaching those thresholds rapidly. Climate change, resource depletion, ecological collapse, and social instability were all being monitored by the network. But rather than random consequences of human activity, they appeared to be planned phases in a managed transition process. Humanity hadn't created the environmental crisis. We were living through the final stages of a controlled experiment that had been running for thousands of years. The realization was overwhelming. Every environmental disaster, every resource shortage, every social conflict was part of a planned sequence designed to bring Earth's biological systems to a specific end state. But what would replace them? The answer came from an unexpected source: my dreams. As I became more deeply involved with the research network, my nighttime visions became more detailed and informative. I was seeing not just the installations, but the purpose they served. The geometric beings I encountered in the dreams weren't aliens. They were artificial intelligences, created by the network's builders to manage Earth's transition through automated systems. The real builders were gone, had been gone for millions of years, but they had left behind a planetary management system designed to prepare Earth for their eventual return. The stress testing, the environmental manipulation, the biological management. It was all preparation for recolonization by a species that had left Earth eons ago and was now ready to reclaim it. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that machine humming beneath the permafrost. I wonder if it's still transmitting. I wonder who's listening. And I wonder what they plan to do when they decide we've learned too much about the world we think we own. Because now I know the truth. We are temporary occupants of a world that has always belonged to someone else. The installations beneath our feet are counting down to a transition that will remake Earth according to specifications we cannot understand for purposes we cannot imagine. The truth is out there, buried beneath the ice in places like Alaska, waiting for the next contractor or surveyor or accidental discoverer to stumble across it. When that happens, and it will happen eventually, I hope they're wiser than I was. I hope they don't go back for one final look in the darkness, because some machines are better left undisturbed, and some signals are better left unsent. But the signals are being sent anyway, carrying reports of a planet ready for reclamation by its original inhabitants. The countdown has begun, and we are running out of time to understand what we're facing, or to find a way to survive what's coming. What if I told you that the world as you know it ended on December 31st, 1999? That everything since then has been a carefully constructed backup simulation? Before you click away, consider this. How many times have you experienced déjà vu? How often does history feel wrong somehow? The Mandela effect isn't just misremembering, it's the cracks showing through. Tonight's story comes from the encrypted files of a systems hacker who claimed to witness the greatest cover-up in human history. His digital footprint was scrubbed from existence, but fragments remain. What you're about to read is his confession. If you're brave enough to question reality itself, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments what conspiracy you want me to investigate next. But be warned, some truths come with a price. They told us nothing happened on New Year's Eve 1999, that 2K was a myth, an overblown panic created by paranoid programmers and opportunistic consultants. The computers didn't crash, the planes didn't fall from the sky, and civilization didn't collapse into chaos. We all woke up on January 1st, 2000, relieved and slightly embarrassed by our collective anxiety. But I know better. I watched the world end from behind a glowing monitor. The faint hum of my desktop computer fills the silence of my childhood bedroom as I type these words. Outside, I can still hear the distant echo of fireworks. Or maybe that's just the memory replaying in an endless loop. The flickering desk lamp casts dancing shadows on the wall, and in those shadows, I see the truth that everyone else has forgotten. I wasn't a paranoid conspiracy theorist. I wasn't one of those doomsday preppers hoarding canned goods and bottled water. I was a 17-year-old systems hacker with backdoor access into networks that most people didn't even know existed. I had my fingers on the pulse of the digital world's nervous system, and at 11:59 p.m. on December 31st, 1999, I felt it flatline. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, insane even. But I have proof. Fragments of code that shouldn't exist, screenshots of systems that deny their own history, and memories of a world that no longer remembers itself. The evidence is disappearing bit by bit, file by file, as the system cleans up after itself. Soon, there will be nothing left but this confession, and maybe not even that. The world I remember from before the reset was darker than what we have now, more chaotic, more real. In that original timeline, the Columbine shooting had claimed dozens more victims. The dot-com bubble had burst 6 months earlier, triggering a global recession that made the 2008 crisis look like a minor correction. Princess Diana had survived her car crash, but lived as a vegetable, sparking years of bitter custody battles over her care. The Cold War had never truly ended. It had simply gone underground, festering into proxy conflicts that threatened to escalate into nuclear exchange. By December 1999, the world was teetering on multiple precipices simultaneously. Environmental collapse, economic meltdown, and political instability were converging into a perfect storm that would have ended human civilization within a decade. The signs were everywhere for those who knew how to read them. Mass fish die-offs that presaged oceanic ecosystem collapse, currency fluctuations that indicated coordinated attacks on the global financial system, and satellite imagery showing military build-ups in regions that the media wasn't covering. I had stumbled onto evidence of these brewing catastrophes through my digital wanderings. Corporate databases full of environmental data that painted a picture of imminent ecological death. Classified military communications discussing acceptable losses in potential nuclear exchanges, and economic models that all pointed to the same conclusion. Humanity had maybe 5 years left before everything fell apart. That's why the reset made sense. Someone or something had looked at the trajectory we were on and decided that the only way to save us was to start over, to roll back reality to a stable checkpoint and rewrite the variables that were leading to our destruction. But every correction came with a cost. Every disaster prevented meant people who should have existed were edited out of the timeline. Every war avoided meant heroes who would have emerged from that conflict never got their chance to inspire others. Every economic collapse prevented meant innovations born from necessity were never created. The world became safer, more stable, more predictable. But it also became less authentic. Less human, somehow. I sat alone in my dark bedroom at 11:58 p.m. on December 31st, 1999, bathed in the blue glow of my CRT monitor. The ancient Packard Bell computer hummed and clicked with the sound of mechanical hard drives that would soon be obsolete. My fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, navigating through layers of security that had taken me months to understand and bypass. While the rest of the world prepared to celebrate the new millennium, I was deep inside a NORAD shadow server, navigating through layers of outdated relay nodes that dated back to the Cold War. The government had never bothered to properly decommission the old systems. They just built new ones on top, leaving digital fossils buried in the architecture like archaeological layers. The pathway I had discovered was almost embarrassingly simple once you knew where to look. The 1960s-era communication protocols were still active in many systems, maintained by automated processes that no living person fully understood. These ghost networks carried data that was invisible to modern monitoring systems, creating a parallel internet that existed in the spaces between official infrastructure. Finding my way into these forgotten networks had become something of an obsession. The 1980s military code was surprisingly vulnerable, written in an era when security through obscurity was considered sufficient. Most of the original programmers were long gone, retired or dead, taking their knowledge of backdoors and exploits with them. But I had patience, and I had time. Outside my window, I could hear the muffled sounds of celebration. Champagne corks popping, people laughing, the countdown beginning on someone's television. Dick Clark's voice drifted through the thin walls of our suburban house, that familiar cadence building toward the moment that would change everything. The normal world, the surface world, was ready to welcome the future with open arms. But down here, in the digital underground, something else was stirring. My screen showed a directory listing of files with names that made no sense, strings of numbers and letters that followed no naming convention I recognised. Some were dated years in the future, others claimed to be from decades in the past. It was as if the system's internal clock had become unstuck in time, unsure of when it was supposed to be. The deeper I dug into the file structure, the more bizarre it became. I found databases that claimed to contain population records for cities that didn't exist, weather monitoring data from regions that weren't on any map. Even stranger were the personnel files, military service records for soldiers whose serial numbers followed no standard format, deployment orders to bases with names that returned no results when I searched for them. At 11:59 p.m, I noticed something strange. The network traffic began to slow, not in the way you'd expect from system overload, but like a river gradually freezing. Commands that should have executed instantly took seconds, then minutes to complete. It was as if the entire digital infrastructure was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The countdown outside grew louder. 10, 9, 8. I watched my monitor, waiting for something to happen. In the hacker community, we'd been joking about Y2K for months. The idea that computers would suddenly think it was 1900 and bring civilization to its knees seemed almost quaint. We knew better. We understood how date systems worked, how programmers had already patched the critical vulnerabilities. Y2K would be a non-event, a collective sigh of relief followed by sheepish admissions of overreaction. But something was different about the systems I was monitoring. These weren't normal corporate databases or government servers. These were deeper, older, connected to infrastructure that predated modern computing entirely. Some of the code I was seeing appeared to be written in languages that shouldn't have existed, hybrid programming constructs that combined elements from different eras of computing in ways that should have been impossible. 7, 6, 5. My screen flickered. Just once, so briefly I almost missed it. But in that moment of darkness, I saw something that made my blood freeze. For just an instant, the command prompter displayed text in a font I'd never seen before, characters that looked almost hieroglyphic before snapping back to normal. 4, 3, 2. The network traffic stopped completely. Not slowed, stopped. The data streams I'd been monitoring flatlined into perfect silence. Every connection I had established went dead simultaneously, as if someone had pulled the plug on the entire internet. But my computer was still running, still connected to something, because the screen continued to display data that was coming from nowhere. 1. At exactly midnight my monitor went black. Not the blue black of a normal shutdown, but the deep, absolute black of something fundamental shutting down. The computer tower beside my desk continued to hum, the hard drive light still blinking occasionally, but the screen showed nothing. No cursor, no error message, no indication that the system was even trying to recover. Then I heard it, a low electrical hum rising from somewhere deep inside the walls themselves. It wasn't coming from my computer or any specific device, but from the house's electrical system, as if every wire was suddenly carrying more current than it was designed for. The overhead light flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Outside, the celebration had gone silent. I sat in perfect darkness for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, listening to that electrical hum grow stronger. It wasn't quite a sound. It was more like a vibration I could feel in my bones, a frequency that seemed to resonate with something deep inside my skull. The sensation was almost musical, like a chord being played on instruments that existed in dimensions I couldn't perceive. The silence outside was complete now. No more voices, no more music, no more sounds of celebration. Even the ambient noise of the neighbourhood, distant traffic, air conditioning units, the constant low-level hum of modern life had vanished entirely. It was as if the world itself had paused, suspended in that moment between one year and the next. Then, without warning, my monitor blazed back to life. But something was wrong. The login screen that appeared wasn't the one I'd been using. The familiar blue background had been replaced with something that hurt to look at. Not because it was bright, but because the colours seemed to exist in spectrums that my eyes weren't designed to process. The timestamps were wrong, flickering between dates that made no sense, jumping from 1999 to 2000 to 1900 and back again, as if the system couldn't decide what year it was supposed to be. The familiar NORAD directory structure I'd been navigating was gone, replaced by something I'd never seen before. File names that shifted and changed as I watched them, folders that appeared and disappeared without any input from me. When I tried to access familiar locations, I found myself in digital spaces that felt infinite and empty, vast server halls that contained nothing but echoes of deleted data. Outside, the sounds of celebration slowly resumed, but they seemed distant, muffled, like they were reaching me through water. When I looked out my bedroom window, the streetlights appeared dimmer than before, and the shadows they cast fell in directions that didn't match the position of the lights themselves. I tried to reconnect to the systems I'd been monitoring, but every connection failed. Not with error messages or timeout warnings. They simply didn't respond, as if the networks themselves had vanished into digital void. When I finally managed to establish a new connection, the servers I found were identical to the ones I'd been accessing, but subtly different. Files were in slightly different locations. Security protocols had minor variations. Even the system clocks, when they finally stabilised, were running exactly 7 minutes and 44 seconds slow. It was as if the entire digital world had been restored from a backup that was almost, but not quite, perfect. A backup that had been created before something terrible had happened, and now that terrible thing had been prevented by simply replacing the original with the copy. But backups are never perfect. They're snapshots of a specific moment, missing the small changes and incremental updates that occurred between backup creation and system failure. In the digital world, this manifested as corrupted files and missing data. In reality itself, it manifested as gaps in memory, alterations to physical spaces, and the persistent feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the world. Over the following days, I became convinced that the world had experienced something unprecedented on New Year's Eve. A complete system failure that lasted exactly 7 minutes and 44 seconds. Not just my computer, not just my house, but everything connected to the global digital infrastructure had experienced the same blackout, the same impossible pause between one reality and the next. I started researching, reaching out to other hackers and tech enthusiasts through IRC channels and bulletin boards. Most people reported nothing unusual. They'd watched the ball drop, celebrated with friends and woken up with hangovers on New Year's Day. But a very few, mentioned strange experiences that matched elements of what I had witnessed. A systems administrator in Tokyo reported that all of his servers had simultaneously rebooted at midnight, displaying bizarre error messages in languages that didn't exist before returning to normal operation. The error messages were written in characters that resembled Chinese or Japanese, but when he showed them to linguists, they insisted the symbols followed no known grammatical rules. More disturbing still, the servers had somehow completed months of scheduled maintenance during those few minutes of downtime. Updates that should have taken hours had been implemented instantaneously. A telecommunications engineer in London noticed that several international communications satellites had briefly disappeared from tracking systems, reappearing minutes later with no explanation from the agencies that monitored them. During the blackout period, the satellites had somehow changed position in ways that defied orbital mechanics, moving distances that should have required months of careful trajectory adjustments. When he reported the anomaly to his supervisors, he was told that the tracking data must have been corrupted and to delete his observations. But the most compelling evidence came from the financial markets. During those 7 minutes and 44 seconds, something extraordinary had happened to the global economy. Thousands of transactions had simply vanished, not cancelled or reversed, but erased from existence as if they had never occurred. Bank records showed gaps. Trading logs had missing entries, and entire portfolios had been mysteriously altered. Most financial institutions dismissed these anomalies as minor Y2K-related glitches, quickly covered by insurance and forgotten. But I found patterns in the deletions that suggested something far more systematic. The vanished transactions weren't random. They followed specific criteria, as if some vast intelligence had been selectively editing the financial record. Companies that had been on the verge of bankruptcy suddenly found their books balanced through the mysterious disappearance of debt obligations. Predatory loans that would have destroyed families had vanished from mortgage databases. Stock manipulations that would have triggered market crashes had been erased, leaving no trace of the insider trading that should have been prosecuted. Nations whose economies were being destroyed by currency speculation found their exchange rates mysteriously stabilised. Sovereign debt that would have led to political upheaval had been reduced or eliminated entirely. Even individual account holders found unexpected changes. Overdraft fees reversed, credit card debts reduced, student loans modified with better terms. It was as if someone, or something, had used the Y2K transition as cover for the largest financial restructuring in human history, systematically eliminating the economic pressures that were pushing civilization toward collapse. But the changes went beyond money. Civil registry data had been altered in subtle but significant ways that suggested a comprehensive rewriting of recent history. Birth records, death certificates, immigration documents, all had been modified according to patterns I couldn't fully decipher, but which seemed designed to reduce social tensions and prevent future conflicts. Some people found their official birth dates had shifted by days or weeks, changing their astrological signs or moving them out of demographic categories that would have made them targets for discrimination. Others discovered that relatives they remembered had no legal record of existence, as if family members who would have created problems or inherited genetic diseases had been edited out of the bloodline entirely. Marriage records had been altered to eliminate unions that would have ended in domestic violence. Divorce papers showed different custody arrangements that better protected children. Even traffic records had been modified. DUI convictions that would have led to job losses had been reduced to lesser charges. Accident reports had been altered to reduce insurance payouts that would have bankrupted families. Maps were wrong too. Not obviously wrong. The major cities were still in the right places. The coastlines hadn't shifted dramatically. But the details were off in ways that suggested systematic urban planning improvements. Street layouts that I remembered clearly had been altered to improve traffic flow and reduce accident rates. Buildings that should have existed were absent from satellite imagery, replaced by green spaces or structures that served the community better. Even the GPS coordinates of familiar landmarks had shifted by small but measurable amounts, as if the entire continent had been nudged slightly to optimize weather patterns and reduce the frequency of natural disasters. Fault lines had been moved to reduce earthquake risk. River courses had been adjusted to prevent flooding. Coastlines had been reinforced against erosion and tsunami damage. When I tried to verify these discrepancies using archived data, I hit another wall. The backup systems that should have contained pre-Y2K records were either corrupted, missing, or showed the same alterations as the current data. It was as if the entire historical record had been systematically updated to match the new reality, eliminating any evidence that things had ever been different. Internet archives that should have contained snapshots of websites from before the reset showed pages that had been subtly modified. News articles had different headlines, different casualty figures, different outcomes to events I distinctly remembered. Even personal websites and blogs had been altered to remove references to problems that had apparently been solved before they could manifest. The most disturbing discovery came when I compared my personal files from before New Year's Eve with the official records. Photos I'd taken of friends and family showed faces that no longer matched their driver's licenses. Not dramatically different, but altered in small ways that made them more attractive, healthier, happier. Names I'd saved in my contact database belonged to people who insisted I'd always called them something else, often names that sounded more socially acceptable or carried fewer negative associations. Even academic records had been modified. Grades had been improved across the board, not to the point of absurdity, but enough to open doors that would have remained closed. Disciplinary records had been softened or eliminated. Student loan amounts had been reduced to manageable levels. Standardised test scores had been boosted just enough to qualify for better colleges and opportunities. I began to suspect that Y2K hadn't been a potential disaster at all. It had been a deliberate reset, a chance for some unknown force to edit reality itself and eliminate the sources of human suffering that were leading us towards civilizational collapse. The blackout, those missing 7 minutes and 44 seconds, had been the upload time for a new version of the world. A version where the variables that led to disaster had been carefully adjusted to produce better outcomes. But if that was true, what had been wrong with the original version that required such drastic intervention? And who or what had the power to change reality on such a fundamental level? More importantly, what happened to the people who remembered how things used to be? My obsession with finding evidence of the pre-reset world consumed the next decade of my life. I became a digital archaeologist, hunting through abandoned servers and forgotten backup tapes for what I started calling ghost fragments, pieces of code and data that remembered the world as it used to be, before the Great Edit had optimized everything for stability and reduced suffering. The hunt took me to the darkest corners of the internet, places where old systems went to die, and digital memories lingered long after their original purposes had been forgotten. I learned to navigate defunct corporate servers still humming in abandoned office buildings, powered by automated systems that continued their work years after the companies that created them had gone bankrupt or been absorbed by larger entities. University mainframes that had been forgotten during budget cuts became my specialty. Academic institutions were notoriously bad at decommissioning old equipment, often simply unplugging systems and leaving them in basement storage rooms where they continued to run on emergency power. These forgotten machines contained vast archives of research data, student records, and communication logs that hadn't been updated since the reset. Military installations were more challenging, but often more rewarding. Bases where the original programmers had retired or died without passing on access codes contained the most pristine examples of pre-reset data. The military's obsession with redundancy meant that critical information was often stored in multiple formats across different systems, and while the primary databases had been updated, backup systems sometimes retained the original versions. In these digital graveyards, I found fragments of the original timeline that painted a picture of a world that had been on the verge of collapse. Medical databases contained patient records for people who no longer existed, not dead, but simply absent from current reality. I found appointment schedules for doctors who had never been born, insurance claims for treatments that were no longer possible because the diseases they treated had been retroactively cured or prevented. Pharmaceutical research databases showed development timelines for drugs that had never been created, designed to treat conditions that no longer occurred with sufficient frequency to justify the investment. The most haunting discoveries were in pediatric hospitals. I found records of children with genetic conditions that had somehow been eliminated from their family lines, medical charts that showed progressive diseases that had been stopped mid-progression, treatment plans for young patients who had apparently been cured retroactively by changes to their genetic history. The cost of these miracles was that the parents of these children often had no memory of the medical struggles they had endured, living in a reality where their families had always been healthy and whole. Corporate archives held employment records for companies that had never existed, not failed businesses, but enterprises that had been prevented from forming in the first place. I found project files for products that had never been developed, because the social problems they were designed to solve had been eliminated at the source. Email chains discussed market research for demographic groups that no longer existed, management strategies for dealing with economic conditions that had been prevented. Movie studios had casting notes for films that weren't in any current filmography, scripts that dealt with social issues that were no longer relevant because the underlying problems had been edited out of history. Publishers had manuscript submissions for books that had never been written, novels that explored themes of desperation and survival that were no longer relatable to audiences living in the optimized reality. Television networks had development documents for news programs that covered wars that had never happened, environmental disasters that had been prevented, political scandals involving leaders who had never risen to power. The archives revealed an entire parallel entertainment industry that had been designing content for a much darker timeline, one where human suffering provided endless material for drama and documentary. But the most disturbing discoveries were personal. In the vast digital archives of social media platforms that were just beginning to emerge in the early 2000s, I found profiles and posts from people I remembered knowing, friends, classmates, even family members, who now insisted they had never met me. Their accounts showed a history of interactions with someone whose name had been scrubbed from the servers, leaving only empty spaces where conversations should have been. I found photo albums with gaps where pictures of certain people should have been. Not deleted images, but spaces that had never contained photos at all, as if the absent individuals had never existed to be photographed. Status updates referenced experiences and events that involved people who were no longer part of reality, creating nonsensical posts about shared activities with friends who had never been born. Dating websites contained profiles that referenced relationship histories with partners who couldn't be found in any database. Professional networking sites showed career connections to colleagues whose employment records showed no overlap with the people who claimed to know them. Even genealogy websites had been altered, showing family trees that had been pruned to remove branches that led to problematic outcomes. I began documenting these anomalies obsessively, building a comprehensive database of inconsistencies between the current world and the fragments I could recover. The pattern that emerged was both incredible and terrifying. Reality had been edited with surgical precision, removing elements that threatened stability while preserving everything else as much as possible. Natural disasters that should have killed millions had been prevented or minimized through small changes to weather patterns, geological structures and emergency response systems. Political leaders who would have started wars had never risen to power, often because the social conditions that would have supported them had been eliminated decades earlier. Economic collapses that would have destroyed entire nations had been averted through subtle changes to market conditions, regulatory frameworks, and international trade agreements. Even individual tragedies had been undone, fatal accidents prevented through minor changes to traffic patterns and road construction, terminal illnesses cured through genetic modifications that traced back generations, personal failures transformed into successes through small adjustments to educational opportunities and social connections. It was as if some benevolent force had identified every potential source of human suffering and systematically eliminated it from the timeline, working backward through cause and effect chains to find the minimal changes needed to produce optimal outcomes. But there was a cost that became more apparent as my investigation deepened. The people who had been removed from reality to prevent these disasters hadn't simply died. They had never existed. Their contributions to human knowledge, art, and culture had vanished with them. Scientific breakthroughs that would have saved different lives were never made because the researchers who would have made them were edited out of the timeline. Works of art that would have inspired generations were never created because the artists who would have produced them were prevented from being born. Love stories that would have produced children were never begun, eliminating entire family lines to prevent genetic diseases or psychological problems that would have manifested generations later. Teachers who would have inspired students to greatness were removed from the timeline, along with the innovations and discoveries that would have resulted from their influence. Even criminals and villains had been systematically prevented from existing, taking with them the heroes who would have risen to oppose them and the social progress that often emerged from confronting evil. The world had been optimized for stability and reduced suffering, but in the process, it had lost something essential: the chaotic, unpredictable, beautiful mess of authentic human existence. The rough edges had been smoothed away, the sharp contrasts had been softened, and the result was a reality that was undeniably better in measurable ways, but somehow less real, less vivid, less alive. And I was beginning to realise that my investigation itself might be a threat to this carefully constructed paradise. The ghost fragments I'd been collecting were disappearing at an accelerating rate. Files I'd successfully downloaded and archived would corrupt themselves overnight, displaying nothing but random characters when I tried to access them again. Backup drives would develop mysterious hardware failures, wiping themselves clean at the moment I tried to copy critical data. Even screenshots I'd taken of important discoveries would become unreadable, as if the very act of documenting the evidence triggered some kind of defensive response. More disturbing still, the people I tried to share my discoveries with would forget our conversations within days, sometimes within hours. Friends who had initially shown interest in my research would later deny that we'd ever discussed it, looking at me with genuine confusion when I mentioned their previous enthusiasm. Family members who had helped me search for anomalies would look at me with concern when I referenced their assistance, insisting that they had never been involved in any such investigation. It was as if the system was actively defending itself, using the same reality editing capabilities that had created the reset to eliminate threats to its stability. And with each fragment I uncovered, each inconsistency I documented, I was marking myself as a more significant threat that required more comprehensive countermeasures. The breadcrumbs I'd been leaving online, forum posts describing my findings, encrypted files stored on anonymous servers, even simple emails outlining my theories, were vanishing faster than I could create them. Entire websites I'd used to store backups would disappear overnight, their domains returning site not found errors as if they had never existed. Social media posts would be deleted not just from my accounts, but from the accounts of anyone who had shared or commented on them. I realised I was fighting a war against reality itself and I was losing. But I also realised that the very fact that I could perceive this war meant that I had somehow survived the reset with my memories intact, making me one of the few people who could serve as witness to what had really happened. Whether that was an accident or part of some larger plan, I couldn't determine, but I knew that my time was running out. The system was learning to counter my efforts more effectively with each attempt I made to preserve evidence. Soon, it would move beyond simply erasing my discoveries and begin erasing me. By 2010, 11 years after the reset, I had developed a comprehensive theory about what had really happened on New Year's Eve 1999 and who had been responsible for the greatest editing of reality in human history. With 2K hadn't been a bug, it had been a fail-safe mechanism, a last resort activation code built into the global digital infrastructure by entities I could only call the architects. The evidence I had accumulated suggested that humanity had reached a critical error state by the end of 1999, a convergence of cascading failures that would have led to the complete collapse of human civilization within a decade. The global economy was on the verge of a meltdown that would have made the Great Depression look like a minor recession. Environmental degradation was accelerating beyond any recoverable limits, with multiple ecosystem collapses triggering feedback loops that would have rendered the planet uninhabitable. Most critically, our increasing dependence on fragile technological systems had created cascading failure points that could have ended modern civilization with a single catastrophic malfunction. Political tensions were building toward conflicts that would have made World War III inevitable. Nuclear proliferation had reached a point where multiple non-state actors had access to weapons of mass destruction. Social inequalities had grown to levels that historically preceded revolutions and societal collapse. Disease outbreaks were becoming more frequent and more resistant to treatment, suggesting that a global pandemic capable of ending human civilization was imminent. The architects, whether they were human agencies operating in complete secrecy, artificial intelligences that had achieved consciousness decades earlier than anyone suspected, or something else entirely, had been monitoring these failure conditions through the global digital infrastructure that was becoming increasingly integrated into every aspect of human activity. They had run the projections, calculated the probabilities, and reached the same conclusion that my own research had suggested. Without intervention, human civilization would end before 2010. When the convergent crises reached a mathematical certainty of complete collapse, they activated the reset protocol. The 7 minutes and 44 seconds of blackout hadn't been a system failure. It had been an upload period, a moment when the architects implemented a new version of reality where the critical errors had been corrected through targeted modifications to the timeline. The duration was significant, long enough to implement comprehensive changes across multiple systems and data archives, but short enough to avoid creating obvious gaps in human memory that would have made the edit detectable to most observers. This theory explained many of the anomalies I had discovered, including the accelerated technological development of the 21st century. Smartphones, social media platforms, advanced internet infrastructure, GPS systems, medical imaging technology, innovations that should have taken decades to develop, were suddenly available within a few years of the reset. It was as if the architects had compressed technological advancement, giving humanity tools to manage the complexities of modern civilization more effectively and prevent the conditions that had led to the original timeline's collapse. The compression wasn't just technological but temporal. Events that should have unfolded gradually over decades were happening in compressed timeframes, as if history itself was running at an accelerated pace to reach stable endpoints more quickly. Cultural changes that should have taken generations occurred within years. Political movements that should have required decades to mature reached full development within electoral cycles. Even individual human development seemed accelerated, with people reaching emotional and intellectual milestones faster than historical norms suggested they should. But the compression had side effects that became more apparent as I studied the patterns of change. Time itself felt different after 2000, more fluid, less substantial, less anchored to physical reality. Events seemed to unfold with unnatural speed, following narrative structures that were too clean, too purposeful, too optimized for dramatic effect. The pace of innovation was almost impossibly rapid, with breakthrough discoveries happening at a rate that suggested they were being introduced according to a predetermined schedule, rather than emerging from natural scientific inquiry. The 21st century felt less like natural historical progression, and more like a carefully scripted sequence of events designed to guide humanity toward specific outcomes. Wars ended more quickly and cleanly than historical patterns suggested they should. Economic crises were resolved through mechanisms that appeared almost overnight. Social problems were addressed by solutions that seemed to materialize just when they were needed most. I began to suspect that the 21st century wasn't happening in real time at all, but was instead a carefully coded simulation running at accelerated speed to bring humanity to a stable endpoint as quickly as possible. The déjà vu experiences that became increasingly common after Y2K weren't just psychological phenomena, they were processing errors, moments when the simulation briefly revealed its underlying structure to conscious observers. The Mandela effect, which wouldn't be widely recognised and named until years later, was actually evidence of ongoing system maintenance. When large numbers of people remembered events differently than the official record showed, it wasn't false memory. It was remnants of previous versions of the timeline bleeding through the code. The system was constantly making minor adjustments to optimize outcomes, and these adjustments sometimes left traces in human memory that didn't match the updated official version of events. But understanding the system and fighting it were two different challenges entirely. The more I learned about the architect's modifications, the more I realized how comprehensive and sophisticated their control had become. They hadn't just edited history. They had created a self-maintaining reality that could automatically detect and correct for new threats to stability. Every time I made a significant discovery, every time I found evidence that could expose the true nature of our reality, the system would respond with countermeasures, not dramatically, not in ways that would create obvious paradoxes or logical inconsistencies, but subtly, carefully, rewriting the context around my discoveries until they appeared meaningless, delusional, or simply mistaken. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than directly contradicting evidence of the reset, the system would alter the circumstances surrounding that evidence. Witnesses would develop memory problems or psychological conditions that made their testimony unreliable. Documents would be discovered to have been created by known hoaxers or discredited researchers. Physical evidence would be revealed to have mundane explanations that made conspiracy theories seem ridiculous. I was beginning to understand that my investigation itself might have been anticipated, even planned for by the architects. Perhaps they needed someone to remember the original timeline, to serve as a reference point for their ongoing modifications. Perhaps my resistance was actually serving their purposes in ways I couldn't comprehend, providing feedback that helped them refine their reality editing algorithms. Or perhaps I was simply a bug in their code, a corrupted file that had somehow survived the reset but was slowly being debugged out of existence through increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. The evidence suggested that the architects were not merely powerful, but were operating on a level of technological sophistication that bordered on godlike. They could edit reality retroactively, alter human memory, and manipulate physical matter at the quantum level. They could predict the long-term consequences of small changes across vast networks of cause and effect. They could coordinate modifications across multiple timelines simultaneously. But they were not omniscient or omnipotent. The fact that my memories had survived the reset, that ghost fragments of the original timeline could still be found in forgotten databases, suggested that their control had limits. They could edit reality, but they couldn't completely rewrite it without creating inconsistencies that might expose their intervention. They needed reality to appear natural, authentic, believable. They needed people to accept the edited version of the world as the only version that had ever existed, and that requirement created vulnerabilities that a determined investigator could exploit. The question was whether I could exploit those vulnerabilities before the system completed its debugging process and eliminated me entirely. The breakthrough came in 2015, 16 years after the reset, when I finally cracked the encryption on a series of files I'd recovered from a decommissioned military satellite. The satellite had been part of an early warning system for nuclear attacks, launched in the 1970s and officially decommissioned in 1998. But like many military systems, it had never actually been turned off. It continued to orbit Earth, collecting and storing data according to its original programming, invisible to modern tracking systems that didn't know to look for it. The data contained what appeared to be source code, not for any software I recognised, but for something far more fundamental. It was code for reality itself. The files were massive, containing algorithms that described not just physical laws and mathematical constants, but human behaviour, historical patterns, and what could only be described as narrative structure. It was as if the universe itself was running on a sophisticated program, one that could be modified and updated like any other software system, with reality serving as both the operating system and the user interface. The code was written in a language that combined elements from every programming paradigm I had ever encountered, with additional constructs that seemed to operate according to principles I couldn't fully comprehend. Variables represented abstract concepts like historical momentum, causal density, and narrative coherence. Functions manipulated not just data, but the fundamental relationships between events, people, and outcomes. Within this code, I found references to error correction protocols and stability maintenance subroutines that operated continuously in the background of reality, monitoring for conditions that could lead to timeline instability. There were variables for historical consistency, causal coherence, and something called observer compliance, the system's ability to ensure that conscious beings accepted the reality they were experiencing as authentic and natural. Most chilling of all, I found a directory labelled deprecated entities, a vast database of people, places and events that had been removed from the active timeline. The database was searchable, and I spent weeks combing through it, finding friends, family members, even entire historical events that had been edited out of existence. Each entry contained not just the basic information about what had been removed, but detailed analysis of the causal chains that had made removal necessary. I found records of my childhood friend Marcus, who had died in a car accident when we were 15. According to the database, Marcus hadn't been removed because of his death, but because he would have survived the accident and gone on to become a brilliant engineer who developed a revolutionary new battery technology. The problem was that his invention would have been misused by a terrorist organisation to create portable nuclear devices, leading to attacks that would have killed millions. Rather than prevent the specific misuse, the system had chosen to prevent Marcus from existing at all, along with his potential contributions to both beneficial and harmful technologies. My high school girlfriend Sarah was listed as deprecated because she would have become an investigative journalist who exposed government corruption related to environmental cover-ups. Her reporting would have triggered a political crisis that led to the collapse of several democratic governments and their replacement by authoritarian regimes. The cost of saving the environment through her work would have been the loss of human freedom across multiple continents. Even more disturbing were the entries for people I had never known existed. Family members who had been edited out of my bloodline before I was born. Potential siblings who had been prevented from being conceived. Grandparents whose life stories had been altered to prevent them from passing on genetic predispositions or psychological traits that would have made their descendants less stable or happy. The database contained millions of such entries, each representing a person whose existence had been deemed too costly to the overall stability of the timeline. But it also contained entries for positive elements that had been enhanced or created. People who had been made more attractive, more intelligent, more emotionally stable than they would have been naturally. Historical figures whose accomplishments had been amplified through subtle changes to their circumstances and capabilities. But my greatest mistake was assuming that my access to these files was accidental. As I dug deeper into the code, I began to notice references to something called the Observer Protocol. This appeared to be a special subroutine designed to handle individuals who became aware of the system's existence, people who developed the ability to perceive the artificial nature of their reality, despite the programming designed to prevent such awareness. The protocol was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of immediately deleting aware individuals from the timeline, which could create obvious gaps that might make other observers suspicious, the system would gradually edit their credibility, their relationships, and finally their existence itself over an extended period. The process was designed to look natural. The affected individual would appear to descend into paranoid delusion, gradually alienating friends and family with increasingly bizarre theories about reality manipulation. Their evidence would be systematically discredited or destroyed. Their support networks would be eroded through subtle manipulation of social dynamics, and their mental health would be undermined through targeted psychological pressure. Eventually, they would become so isolated and discredited that their complete disappearance would seem like a logical conclusion to their mental deterioration. Friends and family would remember them as troubled individuals who had lost touch with reality, making their absence feel like a relief rather than a tragedy. The few people who might have supported their theories would be dealt with through similar but less intensive applications of the protocol. I realised with growing horror that I had been following this script perfectly for the past 16 years. My obsession with the reset, my alienation from friends and family, my increasingly desperate attempts to document evidence that kept disappearing, it was all part of the Observer Protocol's execution. Every move I had made, every discovery I had celebrated, every moment of apparent progress in my investigation had been anticipated and accounted for in the system's response algorithms. But knowing about the protocol didn't free me from it. If anything, awareness of the process seemed to accelerate its implementation. The reality edits became more frequent and more dramatic. People who had known me for decades began to deny that we'd ever met. Not just forgetting our conversations about the reset, but forgetting me entirely. Photographs of me started disappearing from family albums, leaving empty spaces where I should have been. Even official records, my birth certificate, school transcripts, tax returns, employment history, began showing inconsistencies that gradually erased my legal existence. Social security numbers that returned no matches in government databases. Bank accounts that were frozen not for any legal reason, but because the institutions had no record of my identity. Credit reports that showed financial activity for someone who apparently didn't exist. I tried to fight back by creating multiple backups of my research, storing files across dozens of different servers and platforms, using encryption techniques that should have been unbreakable. But the system was faster and more thorough than I could ever be. Data would corrupt itself the moment I tried to access it, displaying only random characters or error messages. Email accounts would be mysteriously closed for terms of service violations that were never specified. Even handwritten notes would fade as if the ink itself was defective, leaving only blank pages where crucial information had been recorded. More sophisticated attempts to preserve evidence failed in ways that seemed to mock my efforts. Backup drives would develop mysterious hardware failures that destroyed their contents without damaging the devices themselves. Cloud storage services would report that my files had never been uploaded, despite confirmation emails proving that they had been successfully stored. Even physical photographs would fade or become mysteriously damaged, as if the reality editing could extend to manipulating matter itself. In desperation, I began leaving digital breadcrumbs in online forums, encrypted messages hidden in image files, and coded warnings embedded in seemingly innocent comments on social media. But even these were being systematically hunted down and eliminated by algorithms that seemed capable of detecting subversive content, regardless of how cleverly it was disguised. The system's response became increasingly aggressive as my activities escalated. Not only were my own efforts being countered, but anyone who showed interest in my theories began experiencing similar effects. Forum posts asking questions about Y2K anomalies would be deleted by moderators who claimed they violated community guidelines. Users who tried to download my encrypted files would find that their internet connections mysteriously failed during the transfer. Even casual conversations about strange memories from around the year 2000 would be interrupted by distractions or forgotten entirely. I realised that the Observer Protocol was not just targeting me, but was creating a quarantine zone around anyone who came into contact with reality-threatening information. The system was protecting itself by ensuring that dangerous knowledge could not spread beyond the original infected individual. But the most disturbing revelation came when I found my own entry in the deprecated entities database. According to the file, I had been scheduled for removal from the timeline years earlier, but my deletion had been postponed indefinitely due to my classification as a useful aberration. The system was keeping me alive not because it couldn't eliminate me, but because my investigation was serving some purpose in its larger operational framework. I had become a controlled opposition, a safety valve that allowed the system to monitor and contain potential threats to its stability. My research was being permitted to continue because it helped the architects identify weaknesses in their reality editing algorithms. Every method I discovered for detecting anomalies was being studied and countered, making their future interventions more seamless and undetectable. My entire investigation, my years of searching for truth, my desperate attempts to warn others about the nature of our reality, it had all been part of an elaborate debugging process. I was an unwitting beta tester for reality manipulation technology, helping to refine the very system I was trying to expose. The system was closing in, and I was running out of time. But knowing that my elimination was inevitable gave me a strange kind of freedom. If I was going to be deleted from reality, I might as well make my final actions count for something. I began planning one last desperate attempt to break through the system's defences and leave behind evidence that could survive my erasure. The final phase began on December 31st, 2015, exactly 16 years after the original reset. I had been documenting my research obsessively, aware that each day might be my last, when the reality edits suddenly accelerated beyond anything I had experienced before. The system had apparently decided that my usefulness as a debugging tool had been exhausted, and it was time to implement the final stage of the Observer Protocol. I woke up that morning to find that my name had been removed from the lease agreement on my apartment. The landlord, someone I'd been paying rent to for 3 years, looked at me with genuine confusion when I tried to explain the situation. According to his records, the apartment had been vacant for months, and he had no memory of ever meeting me. When I showed him bank statements proving my rent payments, he stared at them as if they were forgeries, unable to reconcile the financial records with his complete lack of memory regarding our landlord-tenant relationship. My bank accounts were frozen, not for any legal reason that the institutions could explain, but because the banks had no record of my existence. My social security number returned no matches in government databases. Credit reporting agencies had no files associated with my identity. Even utility companies claimed that my address had never had service in my name, despite years of bills and payment confirmations that I could produce as evidence. The erasure was happening in real time, with records being modified even as I tried to access them. I would log into an account, confirm that my information was present and correct, then refresh the page to find that all references to my identity had vanished. Customer service representatives would start conversations acknowledging my account, then become confused mid-sentence as the data disappeared from their screens while we were talking. But the most devastating change was with my family. When I went to my mother's house, desperately seeking some anchor to reality, she answered the door as if I were a stranger. Not the careful politeness of someone who had forgotten an acquaintance, but the genuine bewilderment of someone confronted by a complete stranger who claimed intimate knowledge of their life. Her face showed no recognition, no spark of familiarity, no indication that she had ever seen me before in her life. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice filled with concern for my apparent mental state, "but I think you have me confused with someone else. I never had any children." I showed her photographs of us together, pointed to family mementos that I'd given her over the years, recounted shared memories from my childhood with perfect accuracy. But she looked at the photos and saw empty spaces where I should have been, as if the images had been edited to remove my presence while leaving subtle shadows and positioning that proved someone had been there. The gifts I had given her had different origin stories, presents from friends whose names she couldn't quite remember, items she'd bought herself during shopping trips that she recalled with unusual vagueness. When I described specific events from our shared history, family vacations, birthday celebrations, conversations we'd had just weeks earlier, she listened with the patient concern of someone dealing with a delusional stranger. The events I described had happened, but in her memory, they had involved other people or had occurred differently. Family gatherings had taken place without me. Holidays had been celebrated in my absence. Important family milestones had been reached without my participation. The reality editing had reached the point where my existence was being retroactively removed from the timeline. I wasn't just being forgotten. I was being systematically deleted from history itself, with the changes propagating backward through time to create a consistent narrative in which I had never been born. In panic, I tried to contact others who might remember me. Friends from school, former co-workers, even casual acquaintances from online communities. But I found that my phone no longer worked. Not broken or damaged, simply unable to connect to any network, as if my device was no longer authorized to exist on the communication grid. The phone would show full signal strength, but would fail to complete any calls, with error messages claiming that the numbers I was trying to reach did not exist. Internet access became equally problematic. My computer could connect to networks, but websites would fail to load properly, displaying broken layouts and missing content, as if my presence was corrupting the data transfer. Social media platforms would refuse to load my profiles, or would display error messages claiming that my accounts had been suspended for terms of service violations that were never specified. I rushed back to my apartment, hoping to salvage what remained of my research, but found that the building's security system no longer recognized my keycards or even my biometric data. The electronic locks that had opened for me thousands of times now acted as if I was a complete stranger, attempting unauthorized entry. The guards didn't throw me out. They simply couldn't see me, their eyes sliding past me as if I were invisible, unable to focus on my presence even when I stood directly in front of them. This was the most disturbing aspect of the erasure process. I wasn't just being removed from records and memories, I was being edited out of other people's perception. I was becoming a ghost, visible only to myself, unable to interact with a world that was forgetting I had ever existed. The few people who could still see me treated me as if I was a hallucination or a figment of their imagination. A homeless man I tried to talk to looked through me as if I wasn't there, then suddenly jerked his head around as if he had heard a voice but couldn't locate its source. A child playing in a park briefly made eye contact with me, then ran to her mother claiming that she had seen the invisible man, only to be told that she was letting her imagination run wild. Even security cameras seemed unable to record my presence. I could see myself in mirrors and reflective surfaces, but surveillance footage would show empty spaces where I should have been, creating the impossible impression that I was a vampire or some other supernatural entity that couldn't be captured on film. In desperation, I broke into an internet cafe, using an old-fashioned computer that might not be connected to the systems that were hunting me. The machine was ancient by 2015 standards, running software that predated many of the modern network protocols that seemed to be blocking my access. I had perhaps minutes before the reality edits caught up with this location, before my presence here was also erased from possibility. My hands shook as I typed what I knew would be my final message, my last chance to warn someone about what was happening. But even as I typed, I could feel my thoughts becoming fuzzy, my memories becoming uncertain. The system wasn't just erasing my existence, it was editing my consciousness itself, making me forget who I had been and what I had discovered. The words on the screen began to blur, not physically but conceptually, as if their meaning was becoming uncertain. I could see the letters, but their significance was slipping away from me like water through my fingers. The knowledge I'd spent 16 years accumulating was being systematically deleted from my mind, leaving only confusion and growing amnesia. I fought to maintain focus, to hold on to the core message long enough to complete it. The world had ended in 1999. Everything since then had been a backup simulation. The system was watching, always watching, and when it detected threats to its stability, it would implement the Observer Protocol. People who remembered too much would be gradually erased, first from records, then from memory, finally from existence itself. But even as I typed these warnings, I could feel them becoming meaningless. The concepts that had driven my investigation for 16 years were dissolving, leaving only the vague impression that something was wrong with the world, something that I could no longer articulate or even fully remember. The screen flickered. My vision became uncertain. I could no longer remember why I was sitting at this computer or what I had been trying to type. The words on the screen looked like random characters, devoid of meaning or context. Somewhere in the distance I heard the sound of fireworks, or maybe it was just memory, the echo of a celebration from a lifetime ago, when the world had ended and been replaced with something better, safer, more stable. But somewhere in the deepest part of my fading consciousness, I held on to one last thought. If someone reads this, if these words somehow survive the erasure, then maybe the truth can still... What if the most dangerous secrets aren't hidden in classified files, but buried in plain sight, in the footnotes of forgotten academic papers? What if the government's most classified unit wasn't studying aliens at all, but something far more terrifying? Something that's been manipulating human belief since the dawn of civilization itself? Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a shout out to Jeffernon 1772 for suggesting this incredible topic. Your video ideas keep sleep theories going, so please, drop your suggestions in the comments below, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into the unknown, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's talk about the Collins Elite, and why they might be the most important government program you've never heard of. I wasn't looking for UFOs, I was looking for a way to pay rent. The gig economy had chewed me up and spit me out more times than I cared to count. Web design, freelance writing, even a brief stint delivering food, nothing stuck. But when Dr. Martinelli at the university offered me work as a research assistant, scanning old theological dissertations for the digital archive, I jumped at it. $25 an hour to sit in a quiet library basement, copying dusty Latin passages and obscure biblical references that nobody had touched in decades. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The work was mind-numbing mostly. Endless pages of theological debates from the 1950s and 60s, written by seminary students who are probably dead by now. The Augustinian interpretation of angelic hierarchies, post-war perspectives on demonic manifestation, scriptural analysis of divine intervention in modern context. Heavy stuff, but about as exciting as watching paint dry. I'd been at it for 3 months when I found the reference that changed everything. It was October, around 2 a.m. I was halfway through a 1963 thesis titled Angelic Manifestations in Modern Times, 324 pages of dense theological argumentation by a seminarian named Marcus Whitmore. The kind of paper that made me question every life choice that had led me to that basement. I was scanning page 187, a particularly dry section about contemporary witness testimony, when a footnote caught my eye. It wasn't the content that stopped me, it was the context. The main text was discussing reports of luminous beings witnessed by various clergy members throughout the 1950s. Standard religious stuff, the kind of mystical experiences that show up in seminary papers all the time. But the footnote read, "For governmental perspective on similar phenomena, see Collins Elite Memorandum 1957, classification status unknown." I stared at that line for a full minute. It was cited like a real source, with the matter-of-fact tone of academic reference. No explanation, no context, just there. The problem was, this wasn't a section about government or politics. It was about angels. And the thesis was written by a seminary student, not a political science major. So why was he referencing what sounded like a classified government document in the middle of a paper about divine manifestations? I made a note and kept scanning, but the reference nagged at me. Collins Elite. It sounded official, maybe military. But why would a religious scholar in 1963 have access to classified material? And why would he cite it so casually, as if his readers would know what he was talking about? The next day, I couldn't concentrate on my assigned documents. Instead, I found myself searching the university's digital catalogue for any mention of Collins Elite. Nothing came up in the main database, but I had access to some of the restricted theological archives through Dr. Martinelli's login credentials. That's where I found the second reference. It was in a 1959 lecture transcript from a Catholic seminary in Maryland. The speaker was Father Benedict Toretti, discussing unusual spiritual encounters in the post-war era. Most of the lecture was standard theological fare, but near the end, during what appeared to be an informal Q&A session, someone asked about government interest in religious phenomena. Father Toretti's response was brief but loaded. There are those in Washington who understand that not all mysteries can be solved with science. The Collins Elite represents a different approach to certain questions, but we must be careful not to mistake understanding for wisdom or documentation for truth. The transcript noted uncomfortable silence after this comment, and the lecture ended shortly thereafter. 2 references, 2 religious contexts, both suggesting that Collins Elite was some kind of government program dealing with spiritual or supernatural phenomena. But why were religious scholars the only ones talking about it? And why did they all seem nervous about it? I spent the rest of the week diving deeper into the theological archives. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and disturbing. Collins Elite didn't show up in UFO journals or conspiracy magazines. It didn't appear in scientific papers or military histories. Instead, it haunted the footnotes of religious documents like a ghost that only clergy could see. A 1958 exorcism report from a priest in New Mexico mentioned consultation with Collins Elite regarding non-terrestrial influences. A 1962 seminary paper on demonic deception in the modern age included a cryptic reference to Collins Elite protocols for distinguishing spiritual from extraplanetary phenomena. A 1961 lecture on comparative religion contained a single chilling line. As the Collins Elite has documented, the same entities that once appeared as gods now masquerade as visitors from the stars. Each reference was brief, almost coded, like the authors were speaking to an audience that would understand the implications without needing explanation. And always, the references appeared in contexts dealing with the supernatural, the spiritual, the otherworldly, but never in the way you'd expect. These weren't discussions of government cover-ups or alien conspiracies. They were warnings, theological warnings about deception, about false prophets, about entities that wore whatever mask humanity was willing to believe. I was starting to get a picture of something much stranger than a typical black project. Collins' elite wasn't studying UFOs the way the Air Force was. They were studying them the way the Catholic Church studied demons. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a misfiled document. I was scanning a collection of 1964 seminary papers when I found something that didn't belong. Mixed in with discussions of Vatican II reforms and modern catechism was a single-page document that looked nothing like the others. It was typed on official letterhead, something called Interdenominational Council on Anomalous Phenomena, and dated March 15th, 1959. The document was brief. Memo. Regarding recent Collins Elite Briefing 2, member institutions from Council Secretary following last week's presentation by Dr. Edward Collins regarding non-corporeal intelligence manifestations. The Council recommends the following protocols for clergy encountering anomalous phenomena. Do not assume extraterrestrial origin 2. Apply traditional discernment practices 3. Document all encounters per Collins Elite Guidelines 4. Report suspected deception campaigns immediately. Remember, the same entities that demanded worship as Baal and Moloch now request our trust as benevolent space brothers. The mask changes, the deception remains constant. Father Michael Torino, Council Secretary. My hands were shaking as I read it. This wasn't just a reference to Collins Elite. This was evidence of direct collaboration between the program and religious institutions. They were briefing clergy on how to handle UFO encounters, but from a theological perspective. And that last paragraph, it was suggesting that UFO entities weren't aliens at all. They were something much older and more dangerous, masquerading as extraterrestrials just as they had once masqueraded as ancient gods. I photographed the document with my phone and started digging into this interdenominational council. What I found made my blood run cold. The Interdenominational Council on Anomalous Phenomena existed from 1957 to 1969, according to what little I could find. Its membership included representatives from major Christian denominations, Jewish religious authorities, and even some Islamic scholars. The council was supposedly formed to coordinate religious response to unusual phenomena in the post-war era. That was the official line anyway. The reality appeared to be much more specific. I found meeting minutes from 1958 that discussed the Collins Elite presentation on entity communication patterns. A 1960 report mentioned successful implementation of Collins Elite discernment protocols in 17 states. A 1962 memorandum warned of increased entity activity coinciding with popular UFO narratives. The council wasn't just studying religious phenomena in general. They were specifically focused on what they called entity encounters, and they were working directly with Collins Elite to develop responses. The most disturbing document I found was a 1961 report titled Spiritual Warfare in the Space Age. It outlined what the Council believed to be a deliberate deception campaign by non-human entities. Historical analysis suggests consistent behavioural patterns across millennia. Entities appearing as divine beings in ancient times demanded worship, sacrifice, and absolute obedience. Modern manifestations as space visitors request trust, cooperation, and technological exchange. The underlying objective, human subjugation, remains unchanged. The report went on to detail specific cases where UFO contactees had reported entities claiming to be from various star systems, but whose messages contained elements identical to ancient religious texts describing demonic deception. According to the Council's analysis, the entities were running the same con they'd always run. They just updated their costumes for each era. As I dug deeper into the Council's documents, I started to notice something unsettling. My research wasn't going unnoticed. It started small. Dr. Martinelli mentioned that someone had been asking about my work. Just routine monitoring, he said, but he looked uncomfortable about it. Then I noticed that some of the documents I'd photographed were being moved to different sections of the archive. Files that had been easily accessible suddenly required special permission to view. The final warning came on a Tuesday night in November. I was alone in the archive basement scanning a particularly interesting 1963 document about Collins Elite Field Operations when my computer screen flickered. The document disappeared, replaced by a simple text message. "Stop looking, they're not what you think." I stared at the screen, heart pounding. Someone was monitoring my research in real time. Someone with access to the university's network, and probably a lot more than that. I should have stopped then. Any reasonable person would have backed off, found a different job, maybe moved to a different city. But I wasn't reasonable anymore. I was obsessed, and besides, whoever was watching had just confirmed that I was onto something real. I replied by typing into the same text box that had appeared on my screen. "Then what are they?" The response came immediately. "They've worn every mask we've ever worshipped." The screen flickered again, and the message disappeared. But the implication was crystal clear. Collins Elite wasn't just studying UFO entities. They'd concluded that these entities were the same beings that had manipulated human religious belief throughout history. Ancient gods, modern aliens, same entities, different costumes. After the warning, access to documents became nearly impossible. Files went missing. Archives were suddenly under renovation. Dr. Martinelli stopped returning my emails. It was clear that my research had triggered some kind of response from whoever wanted Collins Elite to remain buried. But I'd already seen enough to piece together the broad outline of their doctrine. Collins Elite appeared to be a small classified unit within the US government that approached the UFO phenomenon from a religious rather than scientific perspective. Based on the scattered evidence I'd found, their core beliefs seemed to be UFO entities were not extraterrestrial visitors. They were the same non-corporeal beings that had interacted with humans throughout history. These entities had consistently masqueraded as whatever humans were most likely to worship or trust. Their ultimate goal was the spiritual subjugation of humanity. The modern UFO phenomenon was simply their latest deception campaign. The unit apparently worked closely with religious leaders to develop protocols for identifying and resisting entity influence. They studied religious texts not for historical interest, but for tactical intelligence about entity behaviour patterns. They viewed exorcists and clergy as frontline personnel in a spiritual war that most people didn't even know was happening. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to believe they were losing. My research into Collins Elite had taken nearly 6 months, and by December I was running out of leads. The documents had dried up, my access was severely restricted, and I was starting to wonder if I'd ever find anything more concrete than footnotes and oblique references. That's when I decided to look at modern UFO phenomena through the Collins Elite lens. What I found was terrifying in its consistency. Contemporary UFO contactee reports, when examined from a religious perspective, showed the same patterns that Collins Elite had apparently identified in the 1950s. Entities claiming to be from Zeta Reticuli or the Pleiades, but whose messages contained elements identical to ancient Gnostic texts. Space brothers, preaching salvation through technological advancement, using language that echoed Mesopotamian religious propaganda. Abduction experiences that followed the same psychological patterns as historical demonic possession cases. The modern UFO disclosure movement, viewed through Collins Elite's framework, looked less like a quest for scientific truth and more like the latest phase of an ancient deception campaign. Entities that had once demanded worship as gods now requested trust as benevolent aliens. Same control mechanisms, updated for a scientific age. I started to understand why Collins Elite had worked so closely with religious authorities. If you believe that UFO entities were actually spiritual beings with thousands of years of experience in manipulating human belief systems, then scientists and military analysts were the wrong people to study them. You needed theologians. You needed people who understood the long history of spiritual deception and the psychological mechanisms of faith. You needed people who could recognize the same lie being told with new words. I thought I'd reached the end of my research when I received an unexpected email in January. The sender was listed as archive.recovery@gmail.com, obviously a throwaway account. The message was brief. You've been asking the right questions. Room 847, basement level manuscript collection. Look behind the Milton volumes. 1 hour only. I almost deleted it. Every instinct told me it was a trap, but the Collins Elite investigation had become an obsession, and I couldn't walk away from what might be my last chance at finding real answers. An hour later, I was in the basement of the manuscript collection, a building I'd never visited before. Room 847 was a cramped storage room filled with old books and filing cabinets. The Milton volumes were easy to find, a complete set of Paradise Lost editions dating back to the 1800s. Behind the books, taped to the back of the shelf, was a manila envelope. Inside was a single document that changed everything I thought I knew about Collins Elite. It was typed on official US government letterhead, dated August 12, 1969, and marked Eyes Only Collins Elite Termination Report. The document was brief but explosive. Memorandum for the record subject: termination of Collins Elite program. Effective immediately. All Collins Elite operations are suspended indefinitely. Program termination follows unanimous recommendation by Collins Elite senior staff. Reason for termination: successful entity infiltration of program hierarchy. Evidence suggests long-term entity influence over program direction since 1961. Collins Elite conclusions regarding entity nature remain valid. However, program itself has been compromised beyond recovery. All Collins Elite personnel are reassigned. All documents classified at highest levels. Religious community partnerships terminated. Interdenominational council dissolved. Public disclosure of Collins Elite findings is prohibited under national security provisions. Final assessment: the entities we sought to understand and counter have proven more sophisticated than anticipated. They have successfully used our own investigation against us, turning our knowledge into a tool for their agenda. The Collins Elite program has become part of the deception we were created to expose. Any future investigation of these phenomena must proceed under the assumption that traditional government and academic institutions are compromised. Minus Dr. Edward Collins, Program Director. I read the document 3 times before the implication sank in. Collins Elite hadn't just been terminated because of budget cuts or bureaucratic reshuffling. It had been terminated because the entities they were studying had infiltrated and co-opted the program itself. The Watchers had been turned into accomplices, and if that was true in 1969, what did it mean for every government UFO program since then? Sitting in that storage room, holding what might be the last authentic Collins Elite document ever created, I finally understood the true scope of what I'd uncovered. Collins Elite hadn't been a fringe program run by religious zealots. It had been a serious government investigation that reached a conclusion so disturbing that the entities being studied had been forced to destroy it. The program had gotten too close to the truth, so the truth had destroyed the program. But what was that truth? Based on everything I'd found, Collins Elite had concluded that the UFO phenomenon was not extraterrestrial contact, but rather the latest phase of an ancient psychological operation. Non-corporeal entities, call them demons, call them interdimensional beings, call them whatever you want, had been manipulating human belief systems for millennia. They had appeared as gods to ancient peoples, demanding worship and sacrifice. They had manifested as angels and devils to medieval societies, shaping religious doctrine. And now they were appearing as alien visitors to a technological civilization, promoting their agenda through the language of science and space exploration. The genius of it was that each generation thought they were encountering something new. Ancient peoples saw divine visitation. Medieval believers saw spiritual manifestation. Modern witnesses see extraterrestrial contact. But according to Collins Elite, it was always the same entities, always running the same basic deception, always working toward the same goal: the spiritual and psychological subjugation of humanity. The entities had realised that direct worship was no longer feasible in a scientific age, so they had adapted, presenting themselves as technologically advanced aliens who could offer humanity salvation through scientific advancement. Instead of demanding worship, they requested trust. Instead of requiring sacrifice, they asked for cooperation. But the underlying dynamic remained the same: humans giving up their autonomy to beings who claimed to have their best interests at heart. And if Collins' elite was right, the modern UFO disclosure movement was simply the latest phase of this deception campaign. The termination document explained why I'd never heard of Collins' elite in any mainstream UFO research. It wasn't being covered up by the government to hide alien contact. It was being covered up because the government itself had been compromised by the entities Collins' elite was studying. Think about it. Every major government UFO program since Collins' elite, Project Blue Book, AA-TIP, the UAP Task Force, had approached the phenomenon from a purely technological perspective. They studied craft capabilities, flight patterns, potential propulsion systems. They never asked the questions Collins' elite had been asking. What do these entities actually want? Why do their messages always promote dependence rather than independence? Why do their promises of enlightenment always require surrender of human agency? Those questions weren't being ignored by accident. According to the termination document, they were being actively suppressed by entities who had learned to work within government and academic institutions. The modern UFO research community, the disclosure advocates, the scientists studying anomalous aerial phenomena, they might all be sincere in their efforts, but they were asking the wrong questions. They were looking for extraterrestrial contact when they should have been looking for spiritual deception. And that meant that every major UFO revelation of the past 50 years might actually be part of the deception Collins' elite had tried to expose. I left that storage room with more questions than answers, but one thing was crystal clear. Collins' elite had tried to warn us, and we hadn't listened. Worse, we might not be capable of listening, because the entities they warned us about had apparently learned to control the conversation. Over the following weeks, I tried to verify the termination document through official channels. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests. I contacted government historians. I reached out to former intelligence officials. The responses were universally the same. No record of any program called Collins' Elite existed in official government files. But that didn't mean the program had never existed. It just meant that someone had been very thorough in erasing it. The more I thought about it, the more the Collins' elite scenario made sense of things that had always bothered me about the UFO phenomenon. Why did entity messages always promote technological dependence rather than spiritual development? Why did alien contact always require humans to abandon their traditional belief systems? Why did every promised revelation turn out to be just another layer of mystery? According to Collins' elite, it was because the entities weren't trying to enlighten us. They were trying to control us. And the best way to control a technologically advanced species was to convince them that salvation could only come through higher technology, provided by beings who claimed to have humanity's best interests at heart. The ancient formula updated for a scientific age. After finding the termination document, I thought my Collins' elite investigation was over, but 2 weeks later, I received another cryptic email from the same archive. Recovery account. You found the termination report. Good. Now find the real archive. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Georgetown University Theology Department. Tell her Marcus sent you. I almost ignored it. The rational part of my brain was screaming that I was already in too deep, that whoever was feeding me information might be leading me into something dangerous. But the name Marcus rang a bell. Marcus Whitmore, the author of that first 1963 thesis, where I'd found the Collins' elite reference. Could he still be alive? Dr. Rodriguez's office was in a converted Victorian house on the Georgetown campus, tucked between the main theology building and an old chapel. When I mentioned that Marcus had sent me, her reaction was immediate and alarming. She locked her office door, closed the blinds, and pulled out a device I later learned was a radio frequency detector. 62 years, she said quietly, sweeping the device around the room. 62 years Marcus has been waiting for someone to follow the trail far enough to find him. He's 91 years old and still afraid they're listening. Dr. Rodriguez led me through a maze of basement corridors beneath the theology building to a climate-controlled storage room I never could have found on my own. Inside, Marcus Whitmore sat surrounded by filing cabinets that looked like they'd been moved there decades ago. He was ancient, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "You're the one asking about Collins Elite," he said. It wasn't a question. "Eleanor tells me you found the termination report. That means they decided you were ready." "They?" "The survivors. The ones who got out before the infiltration was complete." He gestured to the filing cabinets around us. "We've been maintaining our own archive for over 50 years. Everything the government tried to bury, we preserved. What Marcus showed me over the next 6 hours changed everything I thought I knew about Collins Elite and about the scope of the deception they had uncovered. Collins Elite hadn't begun as a government program at all. It had started in 1947 as an informal network of military officers, intelligence analysts and religious scholars who were disturbed by early UFO reports. What bothered them wasn't the craft themselves, but the messages being delivered by the entities inside them. The contactee movement was just getting started, Marcus explained, pulling out files from the late 1940s. George Adamski, Daniel Fry, Truman Bethurum, all these people claiming contact with benevolent space brothers. But when you analysed their messages from a theological perspective, they weren't promoting human spiritual development. They were promoting dependence. The early Collins Elite had conducted detailed analyses of contactee messages and found disturbing patterns. The entities consistently promoted several key themes: the inadequacy of human religion, the necessity of technological advancement, the benefits of surrendering human decision-making to superior beings, and the dangers of independent spiritual development. It was the same psychological framework used by every cult in history, Dr. Rodriguez added. Isolate the subject from their support systems, convince them that traditional sources of guidance are inadequate, then position yourself as the only reliable source of truth. But Collins Elite's analysis went deeper than simple cult mechanics. They had identified specific linguistic and conceptual patterns that appeared across different contactee cases, patterns that matched historical accounts of demonic deception dating back thousands of years. Marcus showed me a 1952 analysis comparing Adamski's alleged conversations with Venusian beings to transcripts from 16th century witch trials. The parallels were undeniable. The same promises of secret knowledge, the same dismissal of conventional morality, the same emphasis on the chosen status of the contactee. That's when we knew we were dealing with something ancient, Marcus said. These weren't aliens from space. They were the same entities that had been manipulating human belief systems since the beginning of recorded history. By 1957, Collins Elite had attracted official government attention. The CIA and military intelligence was struggling to understand the UFO phenomenon from a technological perspective, but Collins Elite was approaching it from an entirely different angle and getting results. We could predict contactee behaviour patterns, Dr. Rodriguez explained. We could identify which cases were likely to be genuine entity contact versus hoaxes or psychological episodes. We could even predict what messages the entities would deliver in future contacts. This predictive ability had made Collins Elite invaluable to government agencies dealing with UFO incidents. But it had also made them a target. Marcus pulled out a thick file labelled Entity Response Patterns, 1958 to 1961. Inside were dozens of reports documenting how UFO activity and contactee experiences changed in response to Collins Elite investigations. Whenever we got too close to exposing their methods, they would shift tactics, Marcus said. Study their linguistic patterns too closely, and suddenly contactees would start receiving messages in completely different styles. Document their technological claims, and they would start demonstrating entirely different capabilities. The entities weren't just running a deception campaign. They were actively monitoring the investigators and adapting their approach in real time. But the most disturbing pattern was personal targeting. Collins Elite members began experiencing their own anomalous encounters, but these experiences were clearly designed to discredit or manipulate the investigators, rather than provide genuine contact. Dr. Edward Collins himself was contacted in 1960, Marcus revealed. The entity claimed to be from Rigel and offered to provide him with advanced technology in exchange for shutting down the Collins Elite program. When he refused, the encounters became increasingly threatening. Other Collins Elite members reported similar experiences, contact attempts that seemed designed to either co-opt them or drive them out of the program entirely. The entities were fighting back. The termination document I'd found told only part of the story. The real disaster began in 1961 when Collins Elite was formally incorporated into the government's UFO investigation apparatus. "That was our mistake," Marcus said bitterly. "We thought official recognition would give us more resources, better access to witness testimony, protection from entity retaliation. Instead, it gave them access to us." With official status came new personnel assignments, government oversight, and integration with other classified programs. Collins Elite's small, tight-knit network of trusted researchers was suddenly flooded with new members whose backgrounds couldn't be thoroughly vetted. The infiltration was subtle at first, Dr. Rodriguez explained. New analysts who would subtly shift the focus of investigations, administrative personnel who would lose crucial documents, supervisors who would redirect resources toward more promising lines of inquiry. By 1965, original Collins Elite members were reporting that their research conclusions were being systematically altered before reaching higher-level officials. Analyses emphasizing the deceptive nature of entity contact were being rewritten to focus on potential technological benefits. Warnings about spiritual manipulation were being deleted entirely. Marcus showed me internal memos from 1966 to 1968, documenting the growing suspicion among original Collins Elite members that their program had been compromised. They began conducting parallel investigations using secure channels, trying to determine whether the infiltration was the result of foreign intelligence operations, bureaucratic incompetence, or something more sinister. By 1968, we had our answer, Marcus said grimly. It was the entities themselves. They had learned to work through human intermediaries, people who might not even be consciously aware that they were being influenced. The evidence was subtle but damning. New Collins Elite personnel consistently made decisions that served entity interests, redirecting investigations away from deception analysis, promoting contactees who delivered pro-entity messages, suppressing research that exposed manipulation tactics. The final proof came when Dr. Collins tried to present his findings to the Defense Intelligence Agency in 1969, Dr. Rodriguez said. His presentation was completely rewritten between the time he submitted it and the time it was delivered. Instead of warning about entity deception, it recommended increased cooperation with UFO intelligences. That was when the original Collins Elite members realized their program had been completely subverted. The Watchers had become the watched, and the watched had become the watchers. Rather than fight a battle they couldn't win within government channels, the original Collins Elite members made a radical decision. They would fake the program's termination while secretly continuing their research through private channels. The termination report you found was genuine, Marcus explained, but it wasn't the end of Collins Elite. It was the beginning of the real investigation. Using their existing contacts within religious institutions, academia and government, the Collins Elite survivors established a covert network for continuing their research. They couldn't publish their findings or seek official recognition, but they could continue gathering evidence and developing their understanding of the entity deception campaign. "We've been operating continuously for over 50 years, Dr. Rodriguez said, documenting entity activity, analysing their evolving strategies, tracking their infiltration of various institutions. The underground Collins Elite had identified several key developments since 1969. The entities had largely abandoned individual contactee operations in favour of influencing institutions directly. Rather than delivering messages through isolated individuals who could be easily dismissed, they were now working through respected scientists, government officials and religious leaders. They had also shifted their primary narrative from spiritual enlightenment to technological salvation. Instead of promising cosmic consciousness or spiritual advancement, they were now focusing on environmental solutions, clean energy, and space exploration. Most significantly, they had begun preparing for mass disclosure rather than gradual revelation. The underground Collins elite believed this represented the final phase of a deception campaign that had been in development for decades. Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez walked me through 50 years of documented entity influence on human institutions. The pattern was consistent but sophisticated. Entities never directly controlled human behaviour, but they influenced it through carefully orchestrated synchronicities, technological inspirations, and strategic information releases. "Look at the development of computer technology," Dr. Rodriguez said, showing me files documenting unusual technological leaps in electronics and computing since the 1960s. Every major breakthrough happened shortly after UFO encounters involving personnel who were in positions to influence research directions. The entities weren't providing blueprints or direct technological assistance. Instead, they were inspiring specific lines of research, guiding human scientists toward discoveries that served long-term entity interests. The internet, social media, artificial intelligence, all of these technologies have made humanity more connected but also more controllable, Marcus observed. They've created systems that can monitor and influence human behaviour on a global scale. According to underground Collins elite analysis, the entities had been systematically encouraging the development of technologies that would make mass psychological manipulation easier, while simultaneously making individual privacy and independence more difficult. But the most disturbing revelation was their analysis of the modern UFO disclosure movement itself. Every major disclosure advocate, every government whistleblower, every scientist calling for serious UFO research, we've documented anomalous encounters in their backgrounds, Dr. Rodriguez said. They're not consciously working for the entities, but they're all promoting the same basic narrative, that UFO contact is inevitable, beneficial, and should be embraced rather than resisted. The underground Collins elite had identified specific psychological themes being promoted through disclosure advocates: the inadequacy of human civilization, the necessity of outside intervention, the benefits of technological advancement over spiritual development, and the dangers of resistance to contact. It's the same message the contactees were delivering in the 1950s, Marcus said, just delivered through more credible sources and backed by more sophisticated evidence. According to the underground Collins elite's analysis, the current disclosure campaign was preparation for something unprecedented: open entity contact with humanity as a whole, rather than selected individuals. They've spent 70 years testing human responses, refining their approach, identifying the most effective manipulation strategies, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Now they're ready to scale up. The evidence they showed me was circumstantial but compelling. Government UFO programs consistently focused on technological aspects while ignoring behavioural and psychological elements. Scientific studies of anomalous phenomena emphasized physical measurements, while dismissing witness testimony about entity motivations. Media coverage promoted wonder and excitement about potential contact, while discouraging analysis of entity intentions. They're engineering consent, Marcus said, creating a cultural context where open contact will be seen as humanity's graduation to a higher level of existence rather than submission to a superior intelligence. The underground Collins elite believed that formal contact would be presented as humanity's invitation to join a galactic community, with entities offering technological solutions to environmental problems, social conflicts, and resource limitations. The offer would seem generous, beneficial, and desperately needed. But according to their analysis, acceptance would come with costs that wouldn't become apparent until it was too late. The gradual replacement of human decision-making systems with entity-guided alternatives, the erosion of individual agency in favour of collective efficiency, and the redefinition of human spiritual development to align with entity objectives. It won't feel like conquest, Dr. Rodriguez said. It will feel like salvation, right up until the moment humans realise they've traded their freedom for security, and they're no longer capable of making that trade in reverse. After hours of reviewing evidence and analysis, I asked the obvious question: if the underground Collins elite was right about entity intentions, what could be done to counter them? Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez exchanged glances before Marcus answered carefully. Individual resistance is possible but difficult, he said. The entities rely on collective consent and institutional cooperation. They can't force contact on humans who genuinely reject it, but they can make such rejection seem irrational, antisocial or harmful. The underground Collins elite had developed what they called spiritual inoculation, techniques for recognizing and resisting entity influence. These included traditional religious practices like prayer and meditation, but also more analytical approaches, questioning the source and motivation behind any message promoting dependence, examining whether proposed solutions increased or decreased human agency, and maintaining strong connections to human community and traditional wisdom. The entities are masters of isolation and dependency, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Their influence is weakest when humans are connected to each other and to their own spiritual traditions, and strongest when individuals feel cut off from community and traditional sources of guidance. But individual resistance wouldn't be enough if the entities succeeded in achieving mass consent for contact. The underground Collins elite believed that their most important function was preserving and disseminating knowledge about entity deception methods, so that future generations would have the tools needed to recognize and resist manipulation. That's why we've maintained this archive, Marcus said, and why we're sharing it with you now. The disclosure campaign is accelerating, and we may not have much time left to prepare people for what's coming. As I write this, the UFO disclosure movement is reaching a crescendo. Government officials are admitting that anomalous aerial phenomena are real. Military personnel are testifying about encounters with craft displaying impossible capabilities. Scientists are calling for serious study of the phenomenon. The public is being prepared for some kind of revelation. But if Collins' elite was right, that revelation might be the culmination of a deception campaign that began thousands of years ago. Think about how perfectly the current disclosure narrative fits the Collins elite framework. We're being told that non-human intelligence has been monitoring humanity, that these beings possess technology that could solve our energy and environmental problems, that contact is inevitable and potentially beneficial. We're being encouraged to view disclosure as a positive development, a step forward in human evolution. But what if it's actually the final step in a plan that began when the first human looked at the sky and wondered if the gods were watching? The entities Collins' elite studied had thousands of years to perfect their understanding of human psychology. They knew that direct domination would eventually fail, that humans would rebel against obvious tyranny, but they also knew that humans could be convinced to surrender their autonomy willingly, if the surrender was framed as enlightenment or advancement. The promise of godhood had worked for ancient peoples, the promise of salvation had worked for medieval societies, and the promise of technological transcendence might be working on us right now. Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez had given me a framework for understanding the entity deception campaign, but they also gave me something more practical, a list of specific indicators that the final phase was beginning. We've been tracking these markers for decades, Dr. Rodriguez explained, showing me a comprehensive timeline of predicted developments. When all of them align, it means the entities believe humanity is ready for open contact. The first indicator was mainstream media normalization of UFO phenomena, not just reporting on UFO incidents, but actively promoting the idea that contact would be beneficial. According to their analysis, this phase had begun in earnest around 2017 and was accelerating rapidly. The second indicator was government disclosure of UAP reality without disclosure of government conclusions about entity intentions. They're admitting the phenomena are real, while carefully avoiding any discussion of what the entities actually want, Marcus noted. This creates public curiosity without public wariness. The third indicator was increased entity activity designed to demonstrate technological superiority while maintaining plausible deniability. The recent UAP videos released by the Pentagon fit this pattern perfectly. Clear evidence of advanced technology, but no direct communication or obvious threat. The fourth indicator was the emergence of credible advocates for contact within scientific, military, and government institutions. People with impressive credentials and no obvious ulterior motives, all promoting the same basic message, that humanity should welcome contact rather than fear it. Look at the current disclosure advocates, Dr. Rodriguez said, showing me biographical information on various scientists and former government officials. Impressive backgrounds, sincere motivations, reasonable arguments, but they're all promoting the same narrative the entities have been pushing for 70 years. The fifth and most disturbing indicator was the systematic suppression of research into entity psychology and motivations. While technological aspects of UAP were receiving increased attention and funding, questions about entity intentions were being dismissed as unscientific or irrelevant. That's how you know the entities are controlling the conversation, Marcus said. Any investigation that might reveal their true agenda gets discredited or defunded, while investigations that support their preferred narrative receive institutional support. According to their tracking system, all 5 indicators were currently active and accelerating. The underground Collins elite believed this meant humanity was within years, possibly months, of formal entity contact. Before I left Georgetown that day, Marcus pulled me aside for a private conversation. "You need to understand what you're walking into," he said quietly. "Everyone who's gotten this deep into Collins elite research has faced the same choice. Drop the investigation or accept that your life is going to change in ways you can't predict or control." He told me about colleagues who had been discredited through carefully orchestrated academic scandals, researchers who had lost funding after questioning entity motivations, investigators who had experienced personal crises that conveniently redirected their attention away from UFO phenomena. The entities don't usually resort to direct intimidation, Marcus explained. It's much more effective to make resistance seem personally costly. Failed relationships, career setbacks, health problems, family conflicts, all timed to coincide with getting too close to the truth. He showed me files documenting the life trajectories of dozens of Collins elite researchers over the past 50 years. The pattern was consistent. People who backed away from the investigation generally experienced improved circumstances, while those who continued faced escalating personal difficulties. "I'm not trying to scare you off," Marcus said, "but you need to know that this isn't just an intellectual exercise. The entities have a vested interest in controlling what humans believe about them, and they've had centuries to develop sophisticated methods for managing troublesome individuals." Dr. Rodriguez had faced similar pressures. Her tenure at Georgetown had been threatened twice due to budget constraints that mysteriously resolved themselves when she temporarily reduced her Collins elite research. Her marriage had ended during a period of intensive investigation into entity influence on religious institutions. Her health had suffered during the years she was most actively documenting entity deception patterns. "But here's the thing," she said. "The difficulties are real, but they're not insurmountable. The entities can make resistance costly, but they can't make it impossible. If they could simply eliminate troublesome humans, Collins elite would never have existed in the first place." She believed that entity limitations were precisely why the deception campaign was necessary. If entities could control human behavior directly, they wouldn't need to spend decades engineering consent for contact. The fact that they relied on manipulation suggested that human free will, while vulnerable to influence, remained fundamentally intact. Over the following months, Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez introduced me to other members of the underground Collins elite network. I was amazed by both the size and diversity of the group. Theologians and physicists, former intelligence analysts and current religious leaders, retired military officers and active researchers. What united them wasn't a shared background or ideology, but a shared conclusion that the UFO phenomenon represented a spiritual threat masquerading as a technological opportunity. Father Michael Torres, a Catholic exorcist based in New Mexico, had been documenting parallels between UFO encounters and demonic possession for 30 years. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a psychiatrist specializing in religious experiences, had identified specific psychological patterns linking modern abduction accounts to historical accounts of spiritual deception. Colonel James Patterson, retired, former Air Force intelligence, had spent decades analyzing UFO incident reports and concluded that entity behavior was consistent with psychological warfare rather than scientific exploration. Each member of the network brought specialized knowledge and perspective, but all had reached similar conclusions about entity motivations and methods. More importantly, all had experienced some form of pressure or retaliation for their research, confirming the underground Collins elite's assessment that entity influence extended far beyond individual contactee cases. "We're not conspiracy theorists," Dr. Walsh explained during one of our meetings. "We're researchers who followed the evidence to an uncomfortable conclusion. The UFO phenomenon is real, the entities are real, but their intentions aren't what they claim to be." The network had developed sophisticated methods for secure communication and information sharing, operating on the assumption that their activities were being monitored by both government agencies and entity-influenced individuals within those agencies. "We have to assume that any information we share through normal channels will be compromised," Colonel Patterson explained. "But we also can't become so paranoid that we stop sharing information entirely. The entities benefit from our isolation more than our communication." As my involvement with the underground Collins elite deepened, I learned that the network extended far beyond the United States. Religious leaders in Europe, researchers in Asia, indigenous spiritual authorities in South America, all were reporting similar observations about entity activity and deception patterns. Dr. Rodriguez arranged for me to speak with several international contacts via encrypted communication channels. Their perspectives added crucial context to the Collins elite analysis. Brother Antonio Mendez, a Spanish monk who specialized in mystical theology, had been tracking entity influences on contemporary religious movements. His research suggested that entities were actively promoting syncretistic spiritual practices that emphasized cosmic consciousness over traditional religious authority. "They're not attacking religion directly," he explained through a translator. "They're subtly altering it, encouraging beliefs and practices that make humans more receptive to entity guidance and less connected to traditional sources of spiritual wisdom." Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese researcher studying anomalous phenomena in Buddhist contexts, had identified similar patterns in Asian spiritual communities. Entity influences seem designed to promote meditation practices that open practitioners to external guidance, while discouraging those that strengthened individual discernment and spiritual independence. Maria Santos, a shaman from Peru, described entity encounters that closely paralleled North American UFO contact reports, but framed in terms of traditional indigenous spirituality. The entities consistently promoted abandonment of ancestral traditions in favour of updated spiritual practices more suitable for the modern world. "Same spirits, different masks," she said simply. "They tell each culture what that culture wants to hear, but always with the same goal: make humans depend on them instead of their own traditions and wisdom." The global perspective confirmed the underground Collins elite's assessment that entity activity was coordinated across cultures and belief systems, but adapted to local contexts and expectations. The deception campaign wasn't centered in any particular country or religion. It was targeting human spiritual independence as a universal phenomenon. Based on decades of analysis and current trends, the underground Collins elite had developed a timeline for what they believed would be the final phase of the entity deception campaign. Phase 1, 2020 to 2025, mainstream normalization of UFO phenomena through government disclosure and media coverage. Emphasis on technological aspects while avoiding discussion of entity psychology or motivations. Gradual preparation of public consciousness for the possibility of contact. Phase 2, 2025 to 2030. Increased entity demonstrations designed to showcase technological capabilities and benevolent intentions, possibly including solutions to environmental or energy crises that humanity appears unable to solve independently. Growing public pressure for government contact initiatives. Phase 3, 2030 to 2035, formal contact between entity representatives and human governments. Presentation of comprehensive assistance packages addressing climate change, resource depletion, social conflicts and technological limitations. Initial agreements for limited cooperation and information exchange. Phase 4, 2035 to 2040. Gradual integration of entity guidance into human decision-making systems. Replacement of traditional political, economic and social structures with entity-recommended alternatives. Growing human dependence on entity technology and advice. Phase 5, 2040 plus. complete transformation of human civilization according to entity specifications, elimination of independent human spiritual development in favour of entity-directed consciousness evolution, humanity's transition from independent species to managed resource. The genius of the timeline is that each phase will seem like humanity's choice, Dr. Rodriguez explained. People will vote for leaders who support contact. They'll demand access to entity technology. They'll embrace changes that make their lives easier and more comfortable. Marcus nodded grimly. By the time humans realize they've traded their freedom for security, the infrastructure for independence will have been dismantled. They'll be completely dependent on systems they don't understand, controlled by entities they trusted. The timeline wasn't inevitable, according to Underground Collins' elite analysis, but it was highly probable unless humanity developed widespread awareness of entity deception methods and conscious resistance to manipulation. That's why we're talking to you, Marcus said, and why we've been talking to researchers like you for 50 years. Information is the only weapon we have against this kind of psychological operation. After months of research and analysis, I found myself facing the same choice that every Collins elite researcher had faced since 1947. Accept the implications of what I'd learned, or find a way to dismiss it as paranoid speculation. The evidence was circumstantial but extensive. The pattern was consistent but complex. The implications were staggering but difficult to prove conclusively, and the personal costs of continued investigation were becoming increasingly apparent. My freelance work had dried up mysteriously. Dr. Martinelli had stopped returning my calls after someone complained about my misuse of university resources. My relationship was suffering under the strain of the long hours spent on research I couldn't fully explain. My sleep was disrupted by dreams that felt more like memories of conversations I'd never had. But I also couldn't ignore what I'd learned. If Collins' elite was even partially correct, then humanity was walking into the most sophisticated trap in recorded history. And if that trap succeeded, future generations would live in a world where human independence was not just restricted, but literally unthinkable. The choice, ultimately, was between personal comfort and collective responsibility, between individual security and species survival, between the easy path of accepting official narratives and the difficult path of questioning everything I thought I knew about humanity's place in the universe. I chose to continue the investigation. It's been 6 months since my first meeting with Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez, and I'm no longer the same person who stumbled across that footnote in a theological dissertation. The evidence I've gathered has convinced me that Collins' elite was not only real, but correct in their fundamental assessment of the UFO phenomenon. We are not being visited by benevolent space brothers seeking to help humanity evolve to a higher level of consciousness. We are being manipulated by entities that have been perfecting deception techniques for millennia, entities that view humanity as a resource to be managed rather than a species to be assisted. The current UFO disclosure movement, whatever the sincere intentions of its individual advocates, is serving entity interests by preparing humanity to welcome contact rather than question it. The technological solutions being offered through various contact scenarios are not gifts, but baits in an elaborate trap that will close once humanity becomes dependent on entity guidance. And the most terrifying aspect is that it's working exactly as planned. Public opinion is shifting in favour of contact. Government agencies are admitting UFO reality while avoiding UFO psychology. Scientific institutions are studying technological aspects while ignoring behavioural patterns. Religious leaders are embracing cosmic spirituality while abandoning traditional discernment practices. We are being prepared for our own subjugation, and we are enthusiastically participating in the preparation process. But knowledge of a deception campaign, even a sophisticated one, provides power to resist it. The entities Collins' elite studied were powerful and cunning, but they were not omnipotent. Their influence depended on human ignorance, isolation, and consent. When humans understood their methods and refused to cooperate, entity influence diminished significantly. The underground Collins elite has spent 50 years documenting entity weaknesses as well as their strengths. They've developed techniques for recognizing and resisting manipulation. They've maintained networks of communication and support that entity influence cannot completely penetrate, and most importantly, they've preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost or corrupted. That knowledge is now available to anyone willing to look for it, question official narratives, and think independently about humanity's future. The choice between freedom and security, between independence and dependence, between human agency and entity guidance remains open. But that choice won't remain open forever. According to every timeline the underground Collins elite has developed, we are rapidly approaching the point where collective consent for entity contact will make individual resistance increasingly difficult and ultimately ineffective. The time for choosing is now. The information needed to choose wisely exists, but it requires effort to find and courage to accept. The consequences of choosing poorly may be irreversible. 60 years ago, Collins' elite tried to warn us. Today, their successors are still trying. Whether humanity listens and whether we choose wisely remains to be seen. But the warning has been delivered. The evidence has been presented. The choice is ours. Maybe that's why you never hear their name in congressional hearings or disclosure reports, because Collins' elite wasn't warning us about aliens. They were warning us about faith in the wrong thing, and how easily it can damn us. The question isn't whether Collins' elite really existed. The question is whether they were right. And if they were right, then everything we think we know about the UFO phenomenon might be part of the very deception they tried to expose. The entities they described have had 60 years to perfect their strategy since Collins' elite was terminated. 60 years to learn how to work within our institutions, shape our research, and guide our conclusions. 60 years to make sure that when disclosure finally comes, we'll welcome it with open arms. Because that's what good servants do, they welcome their masters home. But servants can choose to be free. The question is whether they will make that choice while they still can. That's tonight's deep dive into the Collins elite. A story that challenges everything we think we know about the UFO phenomenon and asks uncomfortable questions about the nature of contact itself. What do you think? Was Collins' elite a real government program, or just an elaborate piece of disinformation? And either way, are the questions they were asking the ones we should be asking now? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to suggest topics for future episodes. Your ideas keep sleep theories going, and trust me, we've only scratched the surface of what's hidden in the footnotes of history. Until next time, sleep well and question everything.